It was the winter of 1776, and the American Revolution was on the verge of collapse. General Washington's army was freezing, starving, and losing hope. But in a quiet Philadelphia forge, a simple blacksmith named Elias Vance stumbled upon a secret that would change the course of history. A letter sealed in wax, a deadly traitor in the ranks, and a code that only he could break. This is the story of the Silent War, a journey from the ashes of a burning village to the icy waters of the Delaware. Join me as we uncover the hidden hero who saved a nation. If you love immersive historical stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Close your eyes, relax, and let's step back into history. The year of 1776 was bleeding out into a frozen winter that felt less like a season and more like a sentence passed down by a cruel judge. Elias Vance wiped the soot from his forehead with the back of a leather-gloved hand and looked out through the frosted panes of his workshop window, where the wind was whipping the snow into frantic spirals that danced across the cobblestones of the Philadelphia streets. It was a bitter cold that seeped through the thickest wool and settled deep in the bones, making every movement an ache, and every breath a sharp reminder of the fragility of life. Inside the forge, the heat was a tangible weight pressing against the skin, but Elias kept the fire roaring not just for the iron he was shaping, but to keep the creeping despair at bay. He was a man of few words and fewer friends, a blacksmith by trade and a solitary figure by nature who had watched the fervor of the summer turn into the desperate retreat of the autumn, and now the silent, hopeless waiting of the winter. The hammer in his hand rose and fell with a rhythmic clang that rang out like a bell tolling for the dying dreams of independence. Every strike against the glowing red metal sent a shower of sparks cascading onto the dirt floor, momentary stars that flared and died in the gloom, much like the hopes of the Continental Army that was now rumored to be starving and freezing somewhere across the river. Elias turned the metal on the anvil, his eyes narrowing as he examined the curve of the horseshoe he was fashioning. It was mundane work for a time of war, but horses still needed shoes and wagons still needed repairs, even as the world seemed to be crumbling around them. The door to the shop rattled in its frame as a gust of wind slammed against it, and for a moment Elias paused, his hammer hovering in the air, listening not to the wind, but to the silence that followed. It was the silence of a city holding its breath, a city that knew the British were close. General Howe's army was comfortable in New York while Washington's ragtag forces were dwindling by the day, their footprints in the snow marked by blood from shoeless feet. It was the silence of a city holding its breath, a city that knew the British were close. General Howe's army was comfortable in New York while Washington's ragtag forces were dwindling by the day, their footprints in the snow. Elias knew this because he had seen them passing through weeks ago, their eyes hollow and their shoulders slumped under the weight of defeat by blood from shoeless feet. But now the streets were empty save for the occasional patrol and the stray dogs that scavenged in the frozen gutters. He thrust the iron back into the coals and pumped the bellows, watching the orange glow intensify until it was almost blinding. Fire was a simple thing, honest and predictable, unlike the politics of men. He remembered the speeches in the town square, the shouting and the cheering when the declaration was read aloud, the feeling that they were on the precipice of something magnificent. Now that precipice felt more like the edge of a grave. The winter of 1776 was not just cold, it was heavy. It pressed down on the roofs of the houses and the spirits of the people. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, wondering who remained loyal to the crown and who harbored treasonous thoughts of liberty. Elias kept his head down and his mouth shut, for a blacksmith hears many things, but a wise blacksmith repeats nothing. He heard the whispers of the merchants who worried for their trade, the complaints of the farmers whose crops had been seized, and the quiet prayers of mothers whose sons had marched away and had not returned. The iron was ready again, glowing a fierce cherry red, and Elias pulled it from the fire, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years at the anvil. He began to hammer the metal, shaping it to his will, imposing order on the chaos of the raw material. It was a comforting act, this creation of something useful from something formless. It was what the colonies were trying to do, he thought, to forge a nation from the raw, chaotic desire for freedom. But the fire was dying and the hammer was heavy, and the metal was cooling too fast. As he worked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the workshop floor. The light turned from the gray of day to the deep blue of twilight, and the cold began to reclaim the room, creeping in from the corners and under the door. Elias finished the shoe and tossed it into the cooling trough, where it hissed violently, sending a plume of steam into the air. He watched the steam dissipate, vanishing into nothingness just as the year was vanishing. He hung his apron on the hook by the door and began the ritual of closing down the shop. He banked the fire, covering the coals with ash to keep them slumbering until morning, and arranged his tools on the rack. Order, discipline, routine. These were the things that kept a man sane when the world was mad. He barred the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the biting wind, locking the shop behind him. The street was deserted, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. He lived in a small room above the shop, a space that was as sparse and utilitarian as his life. As he climbed the wooden stairs, he felt the fatigue settle in, not just the physical tiredness of a day's labor, but a spiritual exhaustion that seemed to plague everyone he met. He entered his room and lit a single tallow candle, the small flame flickering in the draft. He sat at his small wooden table and stared at the dancing light. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of a church bell tolling the hour, a mournful sound that drifted over the rooftops. Elias was not a soldier. He had not marched with Washington, nor had he stood at Bunker Hill. He was a man who worked with iron and fire, yet he felt the weight of the war as keenly as any general. He knew that this winter would decide everything. If the army could not survive the cold, if the people lost their will to resist, then the dream would die here, buried under the snows of Pennsylvania. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin, turning it over in his fingers. It was a British shilling, the face of King George staring back at him, imperious and unyielding. It was the currency of the land, and yet it felt foreign in his hand, now a symbol of a bond that had been broken not by paper declarations, but by blood and fire. He set the coin on the table and stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the street below. A patrol of Hessian soldiers was marching past, their blue coats dark in the gloom, their muskets shouldered. They moved with a mechanical precision that was both impressive and terrifying. These were mercenary men who fought for coin, not for cause, and they were here to crush a rebellion they did not understand. Elias watched them until they disappeared around the corner, leaving only the rhythm of their boots echoing in the icy air. He felt a sudden surge of anger, a hot spark in the cold ash of his resignation. Why should these men, these strangers, march through his city as if they owned it? Why should a king thousands of miles away dictate the price of his labor and the laws of his life? The anger surprised him, for he was a calm man, a man of peace. But the winter had stripped away the layers of civility, leaving only the raw nerves beneath. He turned away from the window and paced the small room. The candle was burning low, the wax dripping down the side like tears. He thought of the stories he had heard of the soldiers at Valley Forge, and other encampment men wrapping their feet in rags, men boiling leather to eat, men freezing to death in their sleep. They were paying the price for the words written in Philadelphia, while the politicians argued and the merchants hoarded. It was an unjust equation, but war was never just. Elias went to his small cupboard and pulled out a loaf of stale bread and a piece of hard cheese. It was a meager supper, but he had little appetite. He ate mechanically, his mind churning. He knew that he could not remain a spectator forever. The war was not a storm that would pass overhead, leaving him untouched. It was a flood, and the water was rising. He had skills. He knew the land. He knew how to fix things that were broken. Perhaps it was time to fix something more than horseshoes and wagon wheels. The thought terrified him. He was a simple man, not a hero. Heroes were the ones in the stories, the ones who died glorious deaths. He did not want to die. He wanted to live to work his forge, to drink ale in the tavern, to watch the seasons change. But what kind of life would it be if he lived it on his knees? The wind howled again, rattling the window pane as if demanding an answer. Elias finished his meal and blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. He lay down on his narrow cot, pulling the rough wool blanket up to his chin. The darkness was absolutely heavy and suffocating. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Instead, he saw the faces of the young soldiers he had seen, the ones with hollow eyes. He heard the clang of his hammer, the sound of metal being shaped. He realized then that he was like the iron. He had been heated by the fires of the time, beaten by the hardships of the winter. And now, he was cooling, hardening into something new. He did not know what shape he would take, only that he could no longer remain raw material. The winter of despair was not the end. It was a forge. And as he lay there in the cold, dark silence of the night, Elias Vance made a silent vow. He would not just watch the snow fall. He would find a way to light a fire in the winter, to strike a blow against the encroaching dark. Tomorrow he will open the shop as usual. He would heat the coals. He would swing the hammer. But tomorrow he will also listen. He would watch. And when the opportunity came, he would be ready. The night deepened, and the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of white, burying the scars of the war for a few hours. But under the snow, the earth was frozen hard and waiting. Just like Elias, just like the revolution. The winter was here, but spring would come only for those who survived the cold. He drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with the sound of marching boots and the smell of smoke. The story of liberty was not written in ink, but in endurance. And Elias Vance was about to endure his first true test. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray shroud of clouds that hung over Philadelphia, casting a pale and sickly light onto the frozen streets, where the snow from the previous night had already begun to turn into a slush of mud and ice. Elias Vance stood before his forge, his breath misting in the frigid air as he coaxed the sleeping coals back to life with the rhythmic pump of the bellows. The fire caught slowly at first, a reluctant orange glow that deepened into a roaring heart of red and blue, chasing the shadows back into the corners of the workshop. It was a Tuesday, and the city was waking up to another day of occupation. The sounds of British patrols marching in the distance, mingling with the crowing of roosters and the creak of wagon wheels. Elias moved with his usual deliberate slowness, arranging his tongs and hammers, checking the water in the cooling trough, and preparing for the day's labor, but his mind was not on the iron. It was still lingering on the thoughts of the previous night, on the silent vow he had made to himself in the darkness of his room. He felt a strange tension in his chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff waiting for the wind to push him over. The shop was warm now, the heat from the forge radiating outward and warming the stone walls, but Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He heard the sound of a horse approaching fast, its hooves striking the cobblestones with a frantic urgency that was out of place in the early morning quiet. He paused, his hand resting on the handle of a heavy sledgehammer, and listened as the horse pulled up right outside his door, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground. The door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and wind, and a man stumbled inside, closing the door quickly behind him and leaning against it as if to hold back the world outside. He was a stranger, dressed in a long travel-stained cloak that hid most of his features, but Elias could see the wild look in his eyes and the way his chest heaved with exertion. The man was young, perhaps no more than 25, with a face that was pale and drawn, and a dark stain spreading across the side of his cloak, where a hand was pressed tight against his ribs. Elias did not move. He merely watched the stranger, waiting for an explanation, his grip tightening on the hammer. The man looked at Elias, his eyes darting around the shop, checking the windows and the back entrance before fixing his gaze on the blacksmith. He spoke in a hoarse whisper, asking if Elias was the one they called Vance the smith, who worked the iron true. Elias nodded slowly, confirming his identity, but offering nothing more. The man pushed himself off the door and staggered forward, reaching into the folds of his cloak with a trembling hand. He pulled out a small packet wrapped in oilskin and held it out to Elias, his bloodied fingers leaving a smear of red on the dark fabric. He gasped out that he could go no further, that the redcoats were close behind him, and that the message had to get to the river. Elias looked at the packet, and then at the man, realizing in that instant that his quiet life was effectively over. He stepped forward and took the packet, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was heavy for its size and hard, as if it contained something more than just paper. The stranger grabbed Elias' arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a wounded man, and implored him to hide it, to keep it safe until the contact came. He said the fate of the army depended on it, that Washington was blind without the eyes that were written on those pages. Before Elias could ask who the contact was or what was in the packet, the sound of shouting voices and running feet erupted from the street outside. The stranger's eyes went wide with panic, and he backed away, looking for a place to hide. Elias reacted on instinct born of years of solving problems with his hands. He pointed to the coal bin in the corner, a large wooden box filled with heaps of black coal. The stranger nodded, understanding immediately, and scrambled into the bin, burrowing himself under the dark mounds until he was completely hidden from sight. Elias grabbed a shovel and tossed a few fresh scoops of coal onto the fire, creating a sudden burst of smoke and sparks that filled the room just as the door was hammered on with the butt of a musket. The wood splintered under the force, and the door flew open, revealing 3 British soldiers standing in the snow, their bayonets fixed and their faces flushed with the thrill of the hunt. A sergeant stepped forward, his red coat bright against the gloom of the shop, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory intensity. He demanded to know where the rebel spy had gone, shouting that they had seen him enter this very building. Elias turned slowly from the forge, his face a mask of dull surprise, wiping his hands on his soot-stained apron. He spoke calmly, using the slow, measured tone of a simple laborer, telling the sergeant that no one had come in save for himself, and that he had been working the bellows for the past hour. The sergeant stepped closer to the smell of stale tobacco and sweat emanating from him, and poked Elias in the chest with the barrel of his musket. He accused Elias of lying, saying that there were fresh tracks in the snow leading right to the door. Elias looked down at the floor, where the wet footprints of the stranger were indeed visible, leading from the door to the center of the room. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, but he kept his face impassive. He gestured to the footprints and said that a man had indeed come in, a traveler looking for directions to the post road, but that he had sent him out the back way through the alley. It was a gamble, a lie that hung in the air like the smoke from the forge. The sergeant stared at him, his eyes narrowing, weighing the truth of the blacksmith's words against the evidence of his own senses. He signaled to his men to search the back, and 2 of the soldiers pushed past Elias, knocking over a rack of tools as they rushed to the rear door that led to the narrow alleyway behind the shop. The sergeant remained, his gaze lingering on the coal bin, where the stranger lay hidden beneath the black dust. Elias moved back to the anvil, lifting a piece of hot iron with his tongs and raising his hammer. He struck the metal with a resounding clang that filled the small space, causing the sergeant to flinch. Elias apologized, muttering that the iron waited for no man, not even the king's soldiers. He continued to hammer, the rhythmic noise creating a barrier between him and the soldier, a wall of sound that made conversation difficult. The sergeant walked around the shop, poking his bayonet into the corners, overturning a bucket of water and kicking at the piles of scrap metal. He stopped by the coal bin, and Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. The soldier looked down at the coal, the tip of his bayonet hovering inches above the hidden man. Elias struck the iron harder, sending a shower of sparks flying in the sergeant's direction. The soldier cursed and stepped back, brushing the burning embers from his coat. He glared at Elias, warning him to be careful, or he would find himself in irons. Just then, the two other soldiers returned from the back reporting that the alley was empty, but there were tracks leading away towards the market. The sergeant grunted in frustration, casting one last suspicious look at Elias. He told the blacksmith that if he was harboring traitors, he would hang for it before turning on his heel and marching out into the snow, his men following close behind. Elias stood frozen, the hammer still raised in his hand, listening to the fading sound of their boots, until silence returned to the shop. He lowered the hammer and let out a long breath, his knees shaking so hard he had to lean against the anvil for support. He waited another full minute, ensuring they were truly gone before he rushed to the door and bolted it shut. He ran to the coal bin and began to dig frantically, pulling aside the chunks of coal until he found the stranger. The man was unconscious, his face pale as death, the blood from his wound having soaked through his clothes and turned the coal dust into a sticky paste. Elias pulled him out, laying him gently on the floor near the fire. He checked for a pulse, but it was faint, and there was a fluttering bird trapped in a cage. The man's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, glazing over with the haze of death. He looked at Elias and whispered a single word, simply liberty, before his eyes rolled back, and the last breath escaped his lips. Elias sat back on his heels, staring at the dead man in the center of his workshop. Panic began to rise in his throat, a bile of terror. He had a dead rebel spy on his floor and a British patrol that might return at any moment. But then he remembered the packet. He reached into his own pocket where he had hastily shoved it and pulled it out. He moved to the workbench and cleared a space, placing the packet down under the light of the window. He unwrapped the oilskin with trembling fingers, revealing a folded letter, sealed with a thick blob of red wax. There was no address on the front, only a strange symbol pressed into the wax, a hawk with a broken wing. Elias stared at the seal, his mind racing. This was not just a letter, it was a death warrant if found in his possession. He knew he should burn it. He should throw it into the forge and watch it turn to ash, and then he should drag the body out into the alley and claim ignorance. It was the safe thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do. But he looked at the dead man's face, young and peaceful now that the pain was gone. This boy had died because of this letter. He had run through the snow bleeding and was terrified to get this piece of paper to safety. If Elias burned it, the boy's death would mean nothing. It would be a waste of a tragedy lost to history. Elias felt the weight of the coin in his pocket, the king's shilling he had fingered the night before. He looked at the red wax seal, the color of dried blood. He realized that the war had finally walked through his door, and he could no longer pretend to be neutral. He picked up the letter, feeling the texture of the expensive paper. He did not know what it said or who the hawk with the broken wing was, but he knew that he had to finish what the stranger had started. He looked around the shop for a hiding place. The floorboards were loose in places but too obvious. The coal bin was compromised. His eyes fell on the anvil. It was a massive block of iron sitting on a thick stump of oak. The stump was hollowed out slightly at the base to anchor it to the floor. It was a place. No soldier would look at a place that required strength to access. Elias grabbed a crowbar and wedged it under the base of the anvil, straining with all his might to tilt the heavy iron block just an inch. He slid the letter wrapped back in its oilskin into the hollow space beneath the wood, and then let the anvil drop back into place with a heavy thud. It was done. The secret was buried under the very heart of his trade. Now he had to deal with the body. He spent the next hour working with a grim efficiency, dragging the stranger to the back room, where he stored his charcoal, covering him with old sacks and scrap wood. He would have to move him tonight under the cover of darkness, perhaps to the river or to the potter's field. He cleaned the blood from the floor, scrubbing the stones with sand and water until no trace remained. He burned the bloody cloak in the forge, watching the fabric curl and blacken and turn to smoke that was carried away by the chimney. When he was finished, he looked around the shop. It looked the same as it had that morning. The tools were in their place, the fire was roaring, and the smell of hot iron filled the air. But everything had changed. The shadows seemed deeper now, the silence more pregnant with danger. Elias returned to the anvil and picked up his hammer. He began to work on the horseshoe again, striking the metal with a force that was fueled by a mixture of fear and resolve. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a keeper of secrets and a guardian of the silent war. He thought of the letter sitting beneath the anvil, a small, fragile thing that carried the weight of a nation. He wondered what words were written inside, what plans and secrets were locked behind that red wax seal. He would not open it. It was not for him. His job was to be the bridge, the link in the chain that connected the dead spy to the living army. He worked through the day, his hammer ringing out a constant rhythm that masked the turmoil in his mind. Customers came and went. A farmer needing a plowshare fixed a merchant's wife with a broken carriage step. Elias spoke to them in his usual quiet way, nodding and listening, giving no sign that a dead man lay 10 feet away and treason lay beneath his hammer. He played the part of the simple smith perfectly, a role he had rehearsed all his life. But as the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, he felt the eyes of the city upon him. He felt the suspicion in the glances of the passing patrols and the tension in the voices of the people. The letter sealed in wax was a heartbeat pulsing under the floor, drawing him into a world of shadows and deceit. He knew that the contact would come. The stranger had said so. Someone would come looking for the hawk with the broken wing, and when they did, Elias would have to be ready. He would have to judge whether they were friend or foe, whether to give them the letter or the blade of his knife. The sun set early, casting the shop into gloom once more. Elias banked the fire, but this time he did not extinguish it completely. He left a bed of coals glowing red, a reminder of the danger that now lived in his home. He locked the door and went upstairs to his room, but he did not light a candle. He sat by the window in the dark, watching the street. He saw the patrols marching by, their lanterns swinging in the wind. He saw the snow falling, covering the tracks, covering the blood, covering the sins of the day. He touched his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. He was afraid, yes, but he was also alive in a way he had never been before. The letter was safe. The secret was kept. And Elias Vance, the blacksmith of Philadelphia, was ready for whatever the night would bring. The winter was cold, but the fire in the forge was hot, and the fire in his soul was just beginning to burn. The letter sealed in wax had sealed his fate as well, binding him to the cause of liberty with a bond stronger than iron. The sun had long since surrendered to the encroaching night, leaving Philadelphia wrapped in a suffocating blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow the very cobblestones of the streets. Elias Vance stood in the shadow of his own workshop door, his hand resting on the cold iron of the latch, while his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It had been 2 days since the death of the stranger and the burial of the body in the frozen earth of the cellar. Yet the ghost of the event still clung to Elias like the soot that permanently stained his skin. He pulled his collar up high against the biting wind that howled down the alleyway, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the distant stench of the river. Tonight he was not a blacksmith. Tonight he was a man hunting for a ghost, or perhaps he was the prey waiting to be caught. He had found a small scrap of parchment sewn into the lining of the dead man's cloak before he had burned it, a scrap that bore no words but a crude drawing of a tankard and a time marked by the position of a moon. It was a summons or a destination, and Elias knew that the tavern known as the Silent Bell was the only place that fit the description. He stepped out into the street, keeping close to the walls of the houses where the shadows were deepest. The city was under curfew, a law enforced by the bayonets of the British Army, and to be caught out after dark was to invite imprisonment or worse. He moved with a quiet grace, surprising for a man of his size, his boots finding the patches of snow that muffled his steps rather than the ice that would betray him with a crunch. The streets were eerily empty, transformed by the occupation into a labyrinth of fear where every corner could hide a patrol and every window could hide a spy. Elias saw the glow of a lantern swinging in the distance, and he froze, pressing himself flat against the brickwork of a merchant's house, holding his breath as a pair of Hessian soldiers marched past. They were speaking in their native tongue, a harsh guttural sound that grated on the silence of the night, and they did not look left or right. Their attention focused only on the cold and the promise of a warm fire at the end of their shift. When they had faded into the gloom, Elias exhaled a cloud of white mist and continued his journey. The Silent Bell was located near the docks, a rough establishment that catered to sailors and laborers, and now to the lower ranks of the occupying army. It was a place where information flowed as freely as the cheap ale, and where loyalty was often sold to the highest bidder. As Elias approached the tavern, he could hear the dull roar of voices spilling out into the street, a chaotic symphony of laughter and shouting that stood in stark contrast to the deathly quiet of the city. He pushed open the heavy oak door and was immediately assaulted by a wall of heat and noise. The air was thick with the blue haze of tobacco smoke and the smell of roasted meat and stale beer. The room was crowded, packed shoulder to shoulder with men of all allegiances. There were British soldiers in their red coats, their faces flushed with drink, sitting comfortably at the best tables. There were sailors with weathered faces and tar-stained hands huddled in the corners. And there were the locals, the tradesmen and the dockworkers who drank with their heads down their eyes, darting nervously around the room. Elias stepped inside and let the door close behind him, cutting off the wind but trapping him in the den of potential wolves. He moved to the bar, keeping his head low, his hat pulled down to shadow his face. The barkeep was a massive man with a scarred face and a wooden leg who moved with a surprising agility behind the counter, pouring ale from large wooden casks. Elias ordered a tankard of the bitter brew, his voice low and steady, giving away none of the terror that was churning in his gut. He paid with a coin that felt slippery in his sweating palm and took the tankard, turning to face the room. He did not drink. He watched. He was looking for a sign, something that would link the dead boy in his shop to a living, breathing person in this room. He scanned the faces one by one, looking for a hawk with a broken wing or a man who looked like he was waiting for a message that would never come. The soldiers were loud, singing a bawdy song about a milkmaid and a general, their voices slurring together in a drunken chorus. Elias felt a surge of hatred for them, for their arrogance and their comfort while his countrymen froze in the fields, but he pushed it down, burying it deep beneath his mask of indifference. He took a sip of the ale. It was sour and watery, but it wet his throat. His eyes moved to a table in the far corner near the hearth where the shadows were thickest. A man sat there alone, nursing a mug of cider. He was dressed in the clothes of a dock clerk, plain and worn, but there was something about the way he sat that drew Elias' attention. He sat with his back to the wall, his eyes constantly moving, scanning the room with a predator's focus. On the table in front of him lay a small knife, its blade stabbing into the wood, and next to it was a piece of white chalk. Elias watched as the man idly traced a shape on the table with the chalk, a shape that looked remarkably like a wing. Elias felt a jolt of recognition. He waited a moment, ensuring that no one was watching him, and then he began to make his way through the crowd towards the corner. The journey of 30 feet felt like a mile, every step fraught with the danger of discovery. He brushed past a soldier who grunted and shoved him back, but Elias muttered an apology and kept moving. When he reached the table, the man looked up, instantly covering the chalk mark. His eyes were gray and cold, devoid of any warmth. Elias stopped at the edge of the table and took a slow, deliberate sip of his ale. He spoke softly, asking if the seat was taken. The man did not answer immediately, his gaze drilling into Elias, assessing him, weighing him. Finally, he nodded, a barely perceptible movement of his head. Elias sat down, placing his tankard on the table next to the knife. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a whisper that would be lost in the din of the room. He said that the winter was hard on the birds this year. It was a phrase he had improvised a test to see if the man would respond. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he replied that only the hawks who fly too close to the sun get burned. It was not the answer Elias expected, but it was close enough to confirm that this man was part of the game. Elias took a breath and said that he had a visitor 2 nights ago, a bird with a broken wing who could fly no more. The man went still, his hand tightening around the mug of cider until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Elias with a new intensity, a mixture of grief and suspicion. He asked where the bird was now. Elias replied that he was sleeping in the cold earth, where no hunter could find him. A silence stretched between them was heavy and dangerous. The man looked down at the table, his finger tracing the rim of his mug. He whispered that the bird was his brother. Elias felt a pang of sympathy, a shared sorrow that bridged the gap between strangers. He told the man that his brother had died free and that he had left something behind. The man looked up quickly, his eyes wide with urgency. He asked if it was safe. Elias nodded and said it was sealed in iron and stone. The man let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. He told Elias that he was known as Silas and that he was the contact, but that things had changed. He said the British had a new spy catcher, a man named Colonel Vance, no relation to Elias surely, but a man of cruel efficiency who was tearing the network apart. Silas warned that the tavern was not safe and that there were eyes everywhere. As if on cue, the door of the tavern opened, and a hush fell over the room, starting near the entrance and spreading like a wave, until the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Elias turned his head slowly and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, dressed in the pristine uniform of a British colonel, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He had a face that was handsome but sharp like a blade, and his eyes swept the room with a terrifying intelligence. This was the man Silas had spoken of. The colonel walked into the room, his spurs jingling softly, and the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He did not look at the soldiers who scrambled to stand at attention, nor did he look at the barkeep who was bowing low. He walked straight towards the center of the room and stopped, his gaze lingering on the dark corners. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He turned back to Silas, but the seat across from him was empty. Silas had vanished, slipping away into the shadows the moment the colonel had entered. Elias was alone at the table with the chalk mark and the knife. He cursed silently, realizing the danger he was in. If the colonel came over, if he saw the chalk mark, if he asked questions Elias had no answers for. He grabbed the tankard and drained it, trying to look like a drunken fool trying to blend into the scenery. The colonel began to move again, walking slowly among the tables. He stopped here and there, exchanging a few words with a soldier or staring down a local until they looked away in fear. He was hunting, Elias realized. He was looking for fear. He was looking for the one man in the room who did not belong. Elias kept his head down, staring into the bottom of his empty mug, but he could feel the colonel getting closer. He could hear the rhythm of his steps, slow and deliberate. The steps stopped. Elias saw the polished black boots come into his peripheral vision, stopping right next to his table. He forced himself to remain still to keep his breathing even. A gloved hand reached out and picked up the knife that Silas had left behind. The colonel examined the blade, turning it over in the light. He spoke, his voice smoothly and cultured, a velvet wrapping around a steel core. He asked Elias if this was his knife. Elias looked up, feigning a drunken haziness. He shook his head and slurred his words, saying he had never seen it before, that some other fellow had been sitting there and had run off without paying for his drink. The colonel looked at Elias, his eyes pale blue and piercing, searching for the lie. He asked what the other fellow looked like. Elias shrugged and said he was just a shadow, plain and ugly like half the men in this city. The colonel smiled, a thin, humorless curving of his lips. He placed the knife back on the table, point down, so it stood quivering in the wood. He told Elias that shadows had a way of disappearing when the light was shined on them. He leaned closer, the smell of expensive cologne overpowering the stench of the tavern. He whispered that he was the light. Elias held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to show the terror that was screaming in his mind. The colonel studied him for a moment longer, a predator deciding whether to strike. Then he straightened up and brushed a speck of invisible dust from his sleeve. He said, "Enjoy your drink, Blacksmith." Elias froze. He had not told the colonel his trade. His hands were clean, he had scrubbed them raw. But the colonel knew. The colonel turned and walked away, signaling to his men to follow him out. The door closed behind them and the noise of the tavern slowly returned, the tension dissipating like steam. But Elias remained seated, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. The colonel knew who he was. The net was closing. Silas was gone, the letter was under the anvil, and the enemy knew his name. Elias realized that he could not stay here. The tavern, which had been a sanctuary of shadows, was now a trap. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy and numb. He left the knife on the table, he left the chalk mark, he left the comfort of anonymity behind. He walked to the door, pushing his way through the crowd that no longer seemed to notice him. He stepped out into the cold night air and gasped, filling his lungs with the icy wind. He had to get back to the shop. He had to get the letter. He had to run. But as he turned down the street, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps behind him. Not the heavy march of a patrol, but the quiet, stealthy steps of a single pursuer. Elias did not look back. He quickened his pace, his boots slipping on the ice. The footsteps quickened with him. He turned a corner and broke into a run, his breath tearing at his throat. He ran through the twisting alleyways of Philadelphia, dodging through courtyards, and climbing over fences, desperate to lose the tail. He did not know if it was the colonel's man or Silas or someone else entirely. All he knew was that the shadows were no longer just in the tavern. They were everywhere. They were chasing him. He reached the back of his workshop, his lungs burning, his legs trembling. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it in the snow. He fell to his knees, frantically searching for the metal and the white powder. He found it and jammed it into the lock, turning it with a snap. He threw himself inside and bolted the door, leaning back against it and sliding down to the floor. He listened. Silence. No footsteps. No shouting. Had he lost them? Or were they waiting outside, waiting for him to make a mistake? Elias crawled to the window and peeked through the crack in the shutters. The street was empty. The snow was falling again, covering his tracks. He was safe for the moment, but he knew it was an illusion. The encounter in the tavern had changed everything. He was no longer a passive observer. He was a player in the game, and the stakes were his life. He looked at the anvil, the massive iron block that held the secret of the revolution. He knew he could not leave it there. It was too dangerous. He had to move it. He had to decipher it. He had to act. The colonel's words echoed in his mind. I am the light. Elias clenched his fist. If the colonel was the light, then Elias would have to be the darkness. He would have to be the shadow that the light could not find. He stood up and walked to the forge. He lit a small fire, just enough to warm his hands. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and twist. He thought of Silas and the brother who had died. He thought of the letter sealed in wax. He thought of the freedom that seemed so far away. He realized that the war was not just on the battlefields. It was here in the taverns and the workshops, in the glances and the whispers. It was a silent war, and he was now a soldier on the front lines. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He would not run. He would not hide. He would fight. In his own way, with his own weapons, he would fight. He would finish what the dead boy had started. He would be the hawk that flew despite the broken wing. The night dragged on, long and cold, but Elias did not sleep. He sat by the fire, planning and plotting. The shadows in the tavern had followed him home, but he would make them his friends. He would wrap himself in them and use them to strike back. For in the darkness, even the smallest spark can start a fire that burns down an empire. And Elias Vance, the blacksmith, was ready to strike the flint. The decision to leave the only home he had ever known was not made with a fanfare of trumpets, but in the crushing silence of a midnight hour that felt heavier than the iron anvil sitting in the center of the workshop. Elias Vance stood in the darkness of the forge for the last time, his eyes adjusting to the gloom until the familiar shapes of his tools emerged like old friends gathering to bid him farewell. He ran a rough hand over the wooden handle of his favorite sledgehammer, feeling the smooth indentations worn by decades of grip and sweat and labor. It was a physical pain to leave it behind, to leave the smell of coal dust and hot metal, to leave the sanctuary he had built against the chaos of the world. But the sanctuary had become a cage, and the world had broken down the door. He moved to the anvil one last time, wedging the crowbar underneath the base and groaning with the effort as he tilted the massive weight just enough to slide his hand into the hollow space beneath. His fingers brushed the cold oilskin of the packet, and he pulled it out, feeling the wax seal beneath the fabric. This small, fragile object was the reason his life was being upended. It was the reason he was trading the heat of the fire for the biting cold of the winter night. He tucked the packet into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat, pressing it against his chest, as if to warm the secrets it held. He had packed a small canvas bag with the essentials: a loaf of bread, a flask of water, a knife, a length of rope, and a small bag of coins. He took one last look around the shop, memorizing the way the moonlight fell across the workbench, the way the shadows clung to the corners. He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into absolute darkness, and then he turned and walked out the back door, locking it behind him and dropping the key into the deep snow of the alley. He would not be coming back. The city of Philadelphia was sleeping a fitful sleep under the occupation, the streets empty save for the wind that whistled through the eaves of the houses. Elias moved like a shadow, keeping close to the walls, his boots wrapped in strips of burlap to muffle the sound of his steps on the frozen ground. He headed east towards the river, towards the water that separated the occupied city from the wild, uncertain freedom of the Jersey shore. The air was bitterly cold, a sharp knife that sliced through his layers of clothing and stung his exposed face. His breath came in shallow white puffs that vanished instantly in the wind. He navigated the labyrinth of alleyways, avoiding the main streets, where the British patrols marched with their lanterns and muskets. He could hear them in the distance, the rhythmic tramp of boots and the bark of orders carried on the wind, but he saw no one. It was as if the city itself was conspiring to help him, hiding him in its folds and creases. He reached the edge of the waterfront, where the smell of salt and rotting wood filled the air. The Delaware River lay before him, a vast expanse of black churning water that reflected the sparse starlight. It was not a welcoming sight. The river was choked with ice, great jagged slabs of white that ground against each other with a terrifying groaning sound. To cross this water in the dead of winter was madness. It was a suicide mission for a man alone in a small boat, but Elias had no choice. Behind him lay the colonel and his noose. Before him lay the storm. He made his way to a dilapidated boat house that sat tilting precariously over the water's edge, a place Silas had mentioned in their brief meeting. He pried open the rotting door and slipped inside, the smell of damp and mold assaulting his nose. There in the gloom sat a small skiff, old and weathered but seemingly sound. It was a poor vessel for such a journey, but it was all there was. Elias dragged the boat to the water, the wood scraping loudly against the pebbles, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet night. He froze, listening for any reaction, but there was only the sound of the wind and the ice. He pushed the boat into the shallows, the freezing water soaking his boots, instantly sending a shock of pain up his legs. He climbed in and grabbed the oars, the wood rough and cold in his hands. He pushed off, drifting away from the safety of the shore and into the hungry embrace of the river. The current grabbed the small boat, immediately twisting it and pulling it downstream. Elias dug the oars into the water, fighting the river's strength, his muscles straining against the weight of the tide. The ice was the real enemy. Huge floes drifted past him, silent white leviathans that could crush his small craft like an eggshell. He had to navigate a treacherous path, weaving between the blocks of ice, using the oars to push them away when they came too close. The sound of the ice scraping against the hull was a constant, terrifying rasp that set his teeth on edge. He was in the middle of the river, now suspended in a void of darkness between two worlds. The city lights had faded to pinpricks behind him, and the far shore was nothing but a wall of blackness ahead. He felt a small and insignificant speck of dust on the face of a hostile universe. The cold was seeping into his core, making his movements sluggish and clumsy. His fingers were numb, curled into claws around the oars, and he feared he would lose his grip. He focused on the rhythm of the rowing pull, and release, trying to enter a trance state where only the next stroke mattered. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the water like the eye of a searching dragon. Elias threw himself into the bottom of the boat, his heart leaping into his throat. It was a British gunboat patrolling the river, its lantern searching for smugglers and spies. The light swept over the water, illuminating the ice floes with a stark white brilliance. Elias lay pressed against the wet wood of the hull, holding his breath, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The light passed over his boat, moving on to the next patch of darkness. He waited, counting the seconds, his heart pounding against the floorboards. The sound of the gunboat's engine was a low thrum that vibrated through the water, growing fainter as it moved away. Elias sat up, slowly peering over the gunwale. The boat was swallowed by the night. He grabbed the oars again, his fear transmuted into a desperate energy. He rowed harder, ignoring the burning in his shoulders and the numbness in his hands. He had to get across. He had to deliver the letter. The wind picked up, whipping the water into white-capped waves that splashed over the side of the skiff. Elias was soaked to the bone, the water freezing on his coat, turning him into a statue of ice. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they would crack. He looked ahead, searching for the shoreline. It seemed no closer than it had an hour ago. Doubts began to creep into his mind, whispering that he would die here on this dark river, that he would freeze to death and drift out to sea, a frozen monument to a failed rebellion. But then he thought of the dead boy in his shop, the one who had given his life for the packet in Elias' pocket. He thought of the colonel's cold blue eyes. He dug deep, finding a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. He rowed with a savage determination, fighting the river, fighting the cold, fighting the doubt. A large chunk of ice slammed into the side of the boat with a sickening crunch. The skiff shuddered and tipped violently, nearly throwing Elias into the water. He scrambled to regain his balance, his heart racing. He checked the hull. It was cracked water seeping in through a splintered seam. Panic flared hot and bright. He was sinking. He grabbed the small bailing bucket he had brought and began to scoop water frantically, throwing it over the side. Row, bail, row, bail. It became a frantic dance, a race against time. The water was rising around his ankles, cold and deadly. He looked up and saw it. The dark outline of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The shore. It was close. He dropped the bucket and grabbed the oars, rowing with everything he had left. The boat was heavy now, sluggish with the weight of the water. The river seemed to sense his escape and redoubled its efforts to hold him back. The current pulling at the keel, the wind pushing against his chest. But Elias was a blacksmith. He was a man who shaped iron with fire and force. He treated the water like the metal, bending it to his will. The bow of the boat scraped against gravel. It was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. He jumped out, stumbling in knee-deep water, and grabbed the rope at the bow. He hauled the boat up onto the rocky beach, his boots slipping on the slick stones. He collapsed on the shore, gasping for air, his lungs burning, his body trembling uncontrollably. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the starless sky, feeling the solid earth beneath him. He had made it. He had crossed the river. He was alive. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He was on the Jersey side, a wilder land of forests and marshes. He was wet, freezing, and exhausted, but he was free. He checked the pocket of his coat. The packet was still there, dry and safe. He looked back across the river. The city of Philadelphia was lost in the distance and the dark. He felt a strange sense of loss and mourning for the life he had left behind. The forge routine and the simple peace of his trade were all gone. He was no longer Elias the smith. He was Elias the messenger, Elias the rebel. He turned his back on the river and looked towards the dark woods that lay ahead. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. He had to find the Continental Army. He had to find Washington. He began to walk, his stiff legs protesting every step. He walked into the tree line, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag his coat. The snow was deeper here, pristine and white, untainted by the soot of the city. He walked for hours, fueled only by willpower. The cold was a constant companion, a silent predator waiting for him to stop, waiting for him to give up. But he did not stop. He thought of the letter. He wondered what was written inside. Was it a map, a list of names, a declaration of hope? He would never know. His job was only to carry it. He was the vessel's conductor. He came to a small clearing and saw the remnants of a fire. It was old, the ashes cold and scattered, but it was a sign that others had passed this way. He knelt down, examining the ground. There were faint depressions in the snow, almost filled in by the wind. They headed north. Elias followed them. He walked until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, turning the black trees to gray. He was stumbling now, his vision blurring. He needed rest, he needed warmth, but to stop was to die. He saw a shape in the distance, a small cabin nestled against the side of a hill. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin wisp of gray against the white. It could be a friend. It could be a foe. It could be a trap. Elias hesitated, his hand going to the knife at his belt. He had no choice. He approached the cabin slowly, keeping to the trees. He reached the edge of the clearing and watched. A dog barked, a sharp sound that shattered the morning quiet. The door of the cabin opened, and a woman stepped out holding a musket. She looked around, her eyes scanning the woods. She wore a simple homespun dress and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She did not look like a soldier. She looked like a survivor. Elias stepped out from the trees, his hands raised. The woman swung the musket towards him, her face hard and unyielding. He stopped, his voice a croak as he spoke. He said he was a friend. He said he was from Philadelphia. He said he carried a message for the general. The woman lowered the musket slightly, studying him. She saw his wet clothes, his exhaustion and his desperation. She saw the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had looked death in the face and walked away. She nodded slowly and lowered the gun completely. She gestured for him to come inside. Elias walked across, clearing his legs, feeling like lead. He reached the door, and the warmth of the cabin washed over him, a physical embrace that nearly brought him to his knees. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, a pot of something smelling savory hanging over the flames. He stepped inside, and the woman closed the door, shutting out the cold, and the wind and the river. Elias sank onto a rough wooden bench by the fire, his body sagging with relief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the packet, placing it on the table. It was safe. He was safe. The crossing was over. But as he looked into the flames, he knew that the journey had just begun. He had crossed the river, but he had also crossed a line in his soul. He had left behind the safety of neutrality and entered the dangerous world of belief. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, he slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the just. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the river churned its ice towards the sea, but inside the fire burned warm and bright. The silent war had a new soldier, and he had survived his baptism of ice. The warmth of the cabin was a memory that faded with every step Elias took into the white wilderness, leaving behind the woman who had saved him, without asking for his name. He walked north, guided by the position of the pale sun that hung low in the sky like a silver coin frozen in ice. The landscape here was different from the city. It was a wild, untamed place of rolling hills and dense forests where the trees grew close together, their branches interlocking like the fingers of desperate men. He was entering the neutral ground, a strip of land that belonged to no king and no Congress, but was ruled by the law of the musket and the knife. It was a place where neighbors warred against neighbors, where bandits roamed freely under the guise of patriotism, and where a man's life was worth less than the boots on his feet. Elias moved with a caution born of necessity, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for movement, his hand never straying far from the hilt of the knife at his belt. The snow was deeper here, drifting against the trunks of the great oaks and hiding the treacherous roots that sought to trip him. He was tired. his body aching from the exertion of the river crossing and the sleepless nights, but his mind was sharply focused on the mission that had been thrust upon him. The letter in his pocket felt heavy, a burden of lead that grew with every mile. He wondered again what was written inside, what secret was so terrible that men would die to keep it. He pushed the thought away. His task was not to understand but to deliver. He had been given a name by the contact in Philadelphia, a man named Caleb who ran a grist mill near the border of the British lines. Caleb was supposed to be a patriot, a link in the chain that would carry the message to Washington. Elias had memorized the location of a spot where the river bent like a horseshoe, and the old mill wheel turned slowly in the freezing water. The journey took him 2 days of hard walking, filled with the silence of the woods and the gnawing pain of hunger. He avoided the roads, staying on the game trails and the ridges where he could see without being seen. On the afternoon of the second day, he smelled the smoke. It was the scent of burning wood distinct from the clean smell of the forest. He crested a small hill and saw the mill sitting by the water, its large wooden wheel encrusted with ice, but still turning with a slow, groaning rhythm. A small house stood beside it, smoke curling from its chimney, inviting and dangerous. Elias waited in the tree line watching. He saw a man chopping wood in the yard, a large man with a beard that fell to his chest. He saw no soldiers, no red coats, no sign of a trap. But Elias had learned that the absence of danger was not the same as safety. He waited until dusk, until the shadows lengthened and the world turned gray before he made his move. He walked down the hill, his hands raised openly, showing he held no weapon. The man stopped chopping and rested his axe on the block, watching Elias approach. He did not smile, he did not wave, he simply waited. Elias stopped 10 paces away, his breath misting in the air. He spoke the code phrase he had been given, saying that the flour is best when the grain is ground slow. The man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he nodded slowly and replied that the bread rises only for the patient man. It was the correct response. The tension in Elias' shoulders eased slightly, but he did not lower his guard. The man introduced himself as Caleb and gestured for Elias to follow him inside. The house was warm, filled with the smell of sawdust and baking bread. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a golden light over the rough wooden furniture. Caleb offered Elias a seat at the table and poured him a mug of hot cider. It was sweet and spicy, warming Elias from the inside out. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the logs and the distant groan of the mill wheel. Caleb was a man of few words, asking only about the road and the weather, avoiding the topic of the war. Elias studied him. He seemed a solid, dependable man of the earth. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of nervousness that he couldn't quite hide. He kept glancing at the window at the door as if expecting someone. Elias asked about the route ahead, about the best way to slip past the British pickets. Caleb answered readily enough, drawing a map on the table with his finger, tracing the lines of the ridges and the valleys. He told Elias of a hidden path that bypassed the main checkpoints, a goat trail that led straight to the rebel encampment. It sounded too perfect. Elias felt a prickle of unease, a warning instinct that had saved him in the forge. He touched the pocket where the letter lay. He asked Caleb how long he had been part of the network. Caleb hesitated just for a fraction of a second, before answering that he had served the cause since the beginning, since the first shots at Lexington. He smiled, then a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said that liberty was a hungry beast that needed feeding. Elias nodded, sipping his cider, but his mind was racing. The phrase was wrong. The contact in Philadelphia had said that Caleb was a Quaker, a man of peace who helped because of his faith, not because of a hunger for war. A Quaker would not speak of hungry beasts. Elias set his mug down, his hand inching towards his knife. He looked around the room more carefully now. He saw a new musket leaning in the corner, its barrel shining with oil. He saw a fine wool coat hanging on a peg, a coat that was too expensive for a simple miller. And then he saw it. On the mantelpiece above the fire sat a small silver clock ticking softly. It was an intricate piece, delicate and refined, totally out of place in this rustic cabin, and engraved on the front was the Lion of England. Elias went cold. He looked at Caleb and saw the man watching him, his hand resting on the table near a carving knife. The trap had been set, and Elias had walked right into it. He stood up slowly, pretending to stretch. He said he needed to use the privy outside before they ate. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He told Elias to sit, and that supper was almost ready. Elias insisted on taking a step towards the door. Caleb stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He said there was no need to leave, so that the guests would be arriving soon. Guests. The word hung in the air like a sentence of death. Elias looked at the window and saw the movement outside, the flash of red against the white snow. Soldiers. They were already here, surrounding the house. Caleb smiled, a cruel, twisted expression that revealed his true nature. He told Elias that the war was over for him, that the colonel paid well for spies, and even better for their messages. He reached for the carving knife. Elias didn't think, he just reacted. He grabbed the heavy oak table and flipped it with a roar, sending the cider and the candles flying. The room was plunged into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the firelight. Caleb lunged at the knife, flashing, but the table blocked him. Elias kicked the table, driving it into Caleb's legs, sending him crashing to the floor. The door burst open, and 2 British soldiers rushed in, bayonets fixed, shouting orders. Elias grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, wielding it like a hammer. He swung it with all the strength of a blacksmith, striking the first soldier's musket and knocking it from his hands. The second soldier thrust his bayonet, but Elias sidestepped the blade, tearing through his coat but missing his flesh. He brought the poker down on the soldier's arm, hearing the crack of bone. The soldier screamed and dropped his weapon. Elias didn't wait to finish the fight. He turned and threw himself through the window, shattering the glass and the frame, tumbling out into the snow. The cold air hit him like a physical blow. He scrambled to his feet, shards of glass falling from his clothes. He heard shouting from inside the house, Caleb yelling to kill him, to not let him escape. More soldiers were coming, running from the tree line. Elias ran. He ran towards the mill, towards the river. He heard the crack of muskets behind him and the whistle of balls cutting through the air near his head. One struck a tree next to him, sending bark flying into his face. He didn't slow down. He reached the mill wheel, the great wooden structure turning relentlessly. He climbed up the slick, icy sluice, slipping and sliding, his fingers digging into the frozen wood. He pulled himself up onto the axle of the wheel, balancing precariously over the churning black water. The soldiers reached the bank, firing up at him. Elias jumped. He leaped from the mill wheel, catching the branch of an overhanging tree on the far bank. The branch groaned under his weight, dipping low towards the water, but it held. He swung himself up, scrambling onto the bank and rolling into the undergrowth. He was on the other side of the river now, but he was not safe. He could hear the soldiers shouting orders to cross the bridge upstream. He had a lead, but it was small. Elias ran into the woods, ignoring the pain in his lungs and the blood that trickled from the cuts on his face. He ran until he could run no more, until his legs gave out and he collapsed in a heap beneath a pine tree. He lay there gasping for breath, listening to the sounds of the pursuit fading in the distance. He had escaped, but the cost was high. He had lost his trust. He realized now that there was no safety, nowhere to rest. The border was not a line on a map. It was a line in the heart, and it had been crossed. Caleb the miller, the man who was supposed to be a brother, had sold him for a clock and a bag of coins. The betrayal stung more than the cold, more than the cuts. It was a poison that seeped into his soul. Elias checked his pocket. The letter was still there, safe and sound, but he wondered if it was worth it. He wondered if any cause was worth this endless cycle of deceit and death. He sat up, leaning his back against the rough bark of the tree. The night was closing in again, dark and unforgiving. He was alone in the enemy territory, with no guide, no friends, and a pack of wolves on his trail. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stay here. He stood up, his legs trembling. He looked at the stars, seeking the North Star, the only guide that wouldn't lie to him. He found it a tiny pinprick of light in the vast indifference of the universe. He began to walk again, moving deeper into the forest, deeper into the night. He was learning the hard way that in this war the only person he could rely on was himself. He was no longer Elias the innocent blacksmith. He was Elias the fugitive and the survivor. The betrayal at the border had stripped away the last of his illusions, leaving him with a heart of cold iron. He walked on the snow, crunching softly under his boots, a solitary figure moving through a world of shadows. He would deliver the letter. He would finish the mission. Not for the cause, not for the glory, but for spite. He would survive just to prove them wrong, just to deny Caleb his blood money. The anger fueled him, keeping him warm and keeping him moving. And as he walked, he made a new vow. He would trust no one. He would believe nothing but what he could see with his own eyes and touch with his own hands. The world was a lie, but he would be the truth. He would be the blade that cut through the deception. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering secrets he couldn't understand. But he didn't need to understand. He just needed to survive. He walked through the night a ghost in a land of the dead, leaving the betrayal behind him, but carrying the scar of it forever. The border was behind him now, but the real war, the war for his soul, had just begun. He touched the letter one more time, feeling the wax seal. It was his burden, his curse, his destiny, and he would carry it to the end, whatever that end might be. The wind howled through the branches, a mournful song for the lost and the damned. Elias Vance walked on into the darkness, his eyes fixed on the north, his heart closed against the world. He was a weapon now forged in fire and quenched in ice. And weapons do not weep, weapons do not falter. Weapons only strike. The woods were no longer a sanctuary, but a closing jaw. The teeth of the British pursuit snapping at Elias' heels as he stumbled through the frozen undergrowth, his breath tearing at his lungs like jagged glass. He knew he could not run forever. The exhaustion was a physical weight dragging his limbs down, making every step a battle against gravity, and the deep snow was a traitor that held him fast. He heard the baying of hounds in the distance, a mournful, terrifying sound that echoed through the valley and signaled the end of his flight. Elias stopped by a massive oak tree, its roots twisting out of the ground like the gnarled fingers of a giant, and looked around frantically for a place to hide not himself but the burden he carried. He knew that if he were taken with the letter in his pocket, the game was over, and the secrets of the revolution would be laid bare before the enemy. He dropped to his knees, digging frantically into the frozen earth between two large roots, his fingers numb and bleeding as he scraped away the snow and the hard soil. He pulled the oilskin packet from his coat, his heart aching at the thought of letting it go, but there was no other choice. He placed the letter deep in the hole and covered it with dirt, packing it down tight, and then scattering dead leaves and snow over the top to mask the disturbance. He marked the tree in his mind, noting the way a lightning scar twisted down its trunk, a white jagged line against the dark bark. It was done. He stood up just as the first dragoon burst through the trees, his horse steaming in the cold air, the beast's eyes wide and wild. Elias raised his hands, the gesture of a man defeated not by the enemy, but by the elements. The soldier shouted a command and brought the butt of his musket down hard. The world exploded into white light and then faded into a throbbing darkness. When Elias woke, he was moving, or rather being moved. He was tied to the back of a horse, his wrists bound with rough rope that bit into his skin, and he was stumbling along a road that was churned into mud by the passage of an army. His head throbbed with a dull rhythmic pain, and his mouth tasted of copper and dirt. He looked up through swollen eyes and saw the gray stone walls of a fortress rising in the distance, sitting high on the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River. Fort Lee. Once a stronghold of the Continental Army, it now flew the Union Jack, a symbol of the shifting tides of the war. They dragged him through the gates past the jeering soldiers and the piles of supplies, past the rows of cannons that pointed towards the river. Elias tried to walk with dignity to keep his head high despite the pain, but his legs were weak, and he stumbled, earning a kick from one of the guards. They took him to the barracks that had been converted into a prison, a low, damp building that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. They threw him into a cell, a small stone box with a heavy wooden door and a single barred window high on the wall that let in a sliver of gray light. Elias fell onto the straw-covered floor, the impact jarring his bruised ribs. The door slammed shut with a finality that made his heart sink, and the key turned in the lock with a loud clank. He was alone. He lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the fort, the tramp of boots, the shouting of orders, the distant roll of drums. He checked his pockets, though he knew they were empty. His knife was gone, his money was gone, and the letter was gone. He was stripped of everything that defined him as a free man, leaving only the core of who he was: a blacksmith, a patriot, a prisoner. He sat up slowly, leaning his back against the cold stone wall. The cell was freezing, the dampness seeping into his bones. He wrapped his torn coat tighter around himself, trying to preserve what little body heat he had left. He thought of the tree in the woods, the lightning-scarred oak. The letter was safe. That was the only victory he could claim. But would he ever return to retrieve it? The thought was a dark cloud that hovered over him. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting of the light in the window. Then the door opened again, and two guards entered, pulling Elias to his feet and dragging him out of the cell. They marched him across the courtyard to the officers' quarters, a building that was warm and smelled of roasted meat and tobacco. They pushed him into a room and forced him into a chair. Across the desk sat a British lieutenant, a man with a pale face and a cruel mouth. He was cleaning a pistol with a white cloth. His movements are slow and deliberate. He looked up at Elias, his eyes cold and assessing. He asked Elias his name. Elias answered, his voice raspy from disuse, saying he was Elias Vance, a blacksmith from Philadelphia. The lieutenant smiled, a thin, humorless expression. He asked why a blacksmith from Philadelphia was running through the woods near the border like a frightened rabbit. Elias stuck to the story he had prepared, saying he was looking for work because the war had killed his trade in the city, and he had heard there was a need for iron workers in the north. The lieutenant laughed at the sharp barking sound. He called Elias a liar, saying that they knew he had visited Caleb the miller, and that Caleb was a loyal subject who had identified Elias as a spy. Elias felt a surge of anger at the mention of the traitor's name, but he kept his face impassive. He said Caleb was mistaken, that he had only asked the miller for food. The lieutenant stood up and walked around the desk, leaning close to Elias. He whispered that they would find the truth one way or another. He asked where the message was. Elias looked him in the eye and said there was no message, only a hungry man looking for a meal. The lieutenant struck him a backhanded blow across the face that tasted of leather and salt. Elias' head snapped back, but he did not cry out. He tasted blood in his mouth again. The lieutenant paced the room, ranting about the rebels, about the futility of their cause, about the might of the British Empire. Elias listened, his mind drifting away from the pain, focusing on the room. He saw a map on the wall marked with pins. He saw a ledger on the desk. He saw the fire burning in the hearth. He was gathering intelligence, even now, even here. The lieutenant, tired of his game, eventually realizing that Elias would not break so easily. He ordered the guards to take him back and to give him no food until he was ready to speak. They dragged Elias back to the cell and threw him in, leaving him in the darkness once more. The hunger was a gnawing beast in his belly, a constant reminder of his plight. But his mind was clear. He examined the door of his cell, not as a prisoner, but as a craftsman. He ran his fingers over the hinges, feeling the cold iron. They were old, likely forged by a local smith years ago. The pins were rusted. The wood of the door frame was damp and slightly rotted near the bottom. It was strong, yes, but every fortress has a weakness. Elias spent the night working at the hinge with a small splinter of wood he found in the straw, scraping away the rust grain by grain. It was a futile task perhaps, but it kept his mind from breaking. It gave him a purpose. He slept fitfully, his dreams filled with the faces of the dead stranger and the traitor Caleb. He woke to the sound of the morning gun, A booming cannon shot that shook the dust from the ceiling. Another day of captivity. The guards brought him water but no food. They wanted to weaken him to break his spirit through starvation. Elias drank the water, grateful for the moisture, but the hunger remained. He spent the day listening. He heard the soldiers talking outside his door. They spoke of a shipment of powder arriving from New York. They spoke of a planned offensive in the spring. They spoke of the cold and the lack of pay. Elias stored every scrap of information away, filing it in his memory. He was a sponge soaking up the secrets of the enemy. On the third day, a new prisoner was thrown into the cell next to his. Elias could hear the man groaning through the stone wall. He tapped on the wall, a rhythmic code he had learned in the city. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2. There was silence for a moment, then a response. 2 taps, a pause, 3. It was a friend. Elias pressed his face to the crack in the wall and whispered, asking who was there. The voice that came back was weak and trembling. It was a young boy, a drummer from the Continental Army who had been captured during a skirmish. He told Elias his name was Thomas. Elias spoke to him, calmly offering words of comfort, telling him to be strong. The boy's presence gave Elias a new resolve. He was not just fighting for himself, now he was fighting for Thomas too. He realized that he could not wait for the British to make a mistake. He had to make his own luck. He went back to the hinges, working with a renewed, frantic energy. He used a stone he had pried from the floor to hammer softly at the pins, trying to loosen them. It was slow, agonizing work. His fingers were raw and bloody, but he did not stop. That night the lieutenant sent for him again. This time the interrogation was more brutal. They used their fists and they used clubs. They demanded to know about the letter, about the network, about Washington. Elias gave them nothing. He retreated into a fortress of his own mind, a place where the pain could not reach him. He thought of the fire in his forge as the heat of the light. He held onto that image, using it to burn away the fear. When they finally dragged him back to his cell, he was broken and bleeding, but his spirit was intact. He lay on the floor, breathing in shallow gasps. He knew he could not survive another session like that. He had to escape tonight. He waited until the moon was high, until the sounds of the fort had died down to the murmur of the sentries. He crawled to the door and felt the hinges. They were loose. Not enough to pull out with his fingers, but maybe, just maybe, enough to force. He needed a lever. He looked around the cell. There was nothing. Then he remembered the bucket they had given him for waste. It had a metal handle. He emptied the bucket, ignoring the stench, and pried the handle loose. It was a thin piece of iron, but it was metal. He wedged the handle into the gap of the top hinge and pushed. He pushed with all the strength of his blacksmith's arms, pushing past the pain in his ribs, pushing past the exhaustion. The iron groaned. The wood creaked. He paused, holding his breath, listening for the guards. Silence. He pushed again. With a sudden snap, the pin popped up an inch. Elias grabbed it with his teeth and pulled, tasting the rust and the grease. It slid out. The door hung loosely on the bottom hinge. He repeated the process for the bottom hinge, sweating in the freezing air. It was harder, the weight of the door pressing down on it. He strained his muscles, trembling, until finally the second pin gave way. The door was free. He held it up, preventing it from falling and making a noise. He set it gently against the wall. He was out of the cell. He stepped into the corridor. It was empty. The guard at the end of the hall was asleep in his chair with a bottle of rum on the floor beside him. Elias moved like a ghost. He crept up to the guard and took the keys from his belt, moving with the lightness of a thief. He didn't kill the man. He was not a murderer. He locked the guard in his own empty cell, placing the door back and jamming the pins in loosely so it would look secure. Then he went to the next cell and unlocked it. Thomas looked up with his eyes wide with fear and hope. Elias put a finger to his lips, signaling silence. He helped the boy up and they moved together towards the exit. They had to cross the courtyard. The moon was too bright. They stuck to the shadows, hugging the walls. They reached the supply wagons. Elias saw a cart covered with a canvas tarp. He signaled Thomas to get under it. They hid among the barrels of flour, waiting. They heard voices. 2 soldiers were approaching. They stopped right next to the cart lighting pipes. Elias held his breath, his hand over Thomas's mouth. The soldiers talked about the cold, about the women in New York. They stayed for what felt like an eternity before moving on. Elias exhaled. He looked at the gate. It was guarded by 4 men. There was no way to fight them, but Elias remembered the conversation he had heard about the powder shipment. He saw the magazine in the building where the gunpowder was stored. It was near the wall if he could create a distraction. He told Thomas to wait. He crept towards the magazine. The door was locked, but Elias had the keys. He opened it and slipped inside. The smell of sulfur was strong. He found a keg of powder and cracked it open, spilling a trail of black dust towards the door. He took a piece of slow match from a shelf, a rope soaked in chemicals that burned slowly. He lit it with his flint and steel, shielding the spark with his body. He set the match to the powder trail. He had 5 minutes. He ran back to the cart and pulled Thomas out. He pointed to the wall near the cliffs. It was the only unguarded spot because it was a sheer drop to the river. But Elias knew there were goat trails that the locals used. He had seen them on the map in the lieutenant's office. They ran to the wall. The fuse was burning. They climbed up the rough stones, helping each other. They reached the top just as the magazine exploded. The sound was deafening, a roar that shattered the night. The ground shook. Flames shot into the sky, turning the night into day. The guards at the gate turned, running towards the fire. Chaos erupted. Shouting, running, alarm bells ringing. In the confusion, no one looked at the wall. Elias and Thomas slipped over the edge, dropping onto a narrow ledge below. They scrambled down the cliff face, sliding on the ice, grabbing at roots and rocks. It was a terrifying descent into the abyss, but they made it. They reached the riverbank, the frozen Hudson stretching out before them. They were out. They were free. But Elias knew the journey was not over. He looked back up at the burning fort, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He had escaped Fort Lee, but he had left something behind. The letter was still in the woods. He had to go back, not to the fort but to the tree. He had to retrieve the message. He turned to Thomas and pointed south. He told the boy to run to find the army, to tell them what happened. Thomas grabbed Elias' hand, squeezing it tight. He thanked him with tears in his eyes. Then he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Elias stood alone by the river. He was battered, bruised, and starving, but he was unbroken. He turned north, back towards the woods, back towards the danger. He had a promise to keep. The prisoner of Fort Lee was gone. The spy was back. He began to walk the fire of the burning fort, casting a long shadow before him, a shadow that pointed the way to his destiny. The cold wind bit at his face, but he did not feel it. He felt only the burning resolve in his heart. The winter was far from over, but Elias Vance was just getting started. He would find that tree, he would get that letter, and he would make them pay. The silent war continued, and Elias was its most dangerous soldier, for he was the one who had nothing left to lose. The orange glow of the burning magazine at Fort Lee faded slowly behind Elias Vance as he limped into the deep embrace of the forest, leaving chaos and the shouting men far in the distance. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape from the cell and the climb down the cliff face was beginning to drain away, replaced by a cold, aching exhaustion that settled deep in his marrow. His ribs throbbed where the lieutenant had struck him, and his hands were raw and bleeding from the rough stone of the fortress wall. But his mind was fixed on a singular point on the map of his memory. The lightning-scarred oak tree. It stood miles away, back through the enemy-infested woods, back towards the spot where his freedom had ended days ago. Elias moved with the desperate determination of a man who knows that his only salvation lies in the very jaws of the beast he has just escaped. The snow was falling again, a soft, relentless powder that covered his tracks almost as soon as he made them, but also obscured the treacherous roots and rocks that lay beneath. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a birch tree, its white bark ghostly in the gloom. He listened. The woods were alive, not with the sounds of nature which had gone silent in the freezing cold, but with the sounds of men. He could hear the distant blowing of bugles, the shouting of orders carried on the wind, and the occasional crack of a musket. The British were casting a wide net searching for the arsonist who had destroyed their supplies. Elias knew he was the mouse in a field of hawks. He pushed himself off the tree and continued north, keeping to the low ground, moving through the ravines and the frozen creek beds where the shadows were deepest. He had walked for perhaps an hour when he heard a sound that did not belong to the hunt. It was a low groaning sound of human pain that came from a cluster of rocks near the base of a small ridge. Elias froze his hand, going instantly to the knife he had taken from the guard. He crept forward silent as the falling snow peered into the darkness. There, slumped against a boulder half buried in a drift, was a man. He wore the scarlet coat of a British officer, the gold braid on his shoulders glinting faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the trees. He was not moving save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Elias approached with caution, his weapon raised ready to strike. This was the enemy. This was one of the men who had beaten him, who had starved him, who had laughed at the idea of liberty. It would be easy to end him here, to slide the knife between his ribs and leave him for the wolves. It would be justice. Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the snow. The officer's head snapped up, his eyes wide and filled with pain. He tried to reach for the sword at his hip, but his hand was weak and clumsy, fumbling uselessly at the hilt. Elias saw the problem then. The officer's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, pinned beneath a heavy fallen log that had likely come down during the storm, or perhaps he had fallen and the rot had given way. The wood had trapped him, crushing the bone. The officer looked at Elias, seeing the ragged clothes, the desperate face, and the knife in his hand. He slumped back against the rock, a bitter smile touching his lips. He spoke, his voice tight with pain, saying, "Well, get on with it then, rebel." He closed his eyes, waiting for the blow. Elias stood over him, the knife heavy in his hand. He looked at the man's face. He was younger than Elias had expected, with a face that was not twisted by the cruelty he had seen in the lieutenant or the colonel. It was a face of fear and resignation. Elias thought of the boy Thomas running south to safety. He thought of the dead stranger in his shop. He thought of the war that was turning men into monsters. If he killed this man now in cold blood, how was he any different from them? How was he different from Caleb the traitor? Elias slowly lowered the knife. He knelt down beside the log, ignoring the officer's flinch. He examined the wood. It was a heavy, thick branch of oak, but it was not immovable. He looked at the officer and asked him his name. The man opened his eyes, surprised that he was not yet dead. He answered that he was Captain Arthur Thorne of the King's 5th Regiment. Elias nodded. He introduced himself simply as Elias. He told Thorne that he was going to lift the log, and that Thorne would have to pull his leg free. Thorne looked at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, asking why he would help an enemy. Elias didn't have a good answer. He simply said that the cold would kill them both soon enough, and he didn't want a ghost haunting his trail. He positioned himself under the branch, finding a leverage point. He gritted his teeth and pushed, channeling all his blacksmith strength into his legs and back. The log groaned and shifted, lifting a few inches. Thorne gasped and dragged his leg out, crying out in agony as the broken bones shifted. Elias dropped the log back down with a thud and fell back into the snow, panting. Thorne lay there clutching his leg, his face pale as the snow around him. He looked at Elias, his breathing ragged. He whispered a thank you. Elias shrugged, tearing a strip of cloth from his own shirt to bind the captain's leg. He found a sturdy branch and fashioned a crude splint, tying it tight. Thorne watched him, his eyes searching Elias' face. He asked where Elias was going. Elias replied that he was going north. Thorne laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He said that north was where the entire British army was searching, that Elias was walking into a trap. Elias said he had no choice. Thorne struggled to sit up, wincing. He said that he too needed to go north to rejoin his unit, but he could not walk alone. He proposed a trade. He said that he knew the patrol routes, he knew the passwords, and he knew where the sentries were posted. If Elias helped him walk, he would get them both through the lines. It was an insane idea, an alliance with the enemy. a fox and a hound walking together. But Elias looked at the woods around them. He knew he could not sneak past the alert patrols alone, not in his condition, and Thorn would surely freeze to death if left here. It was a gamble, but Elias was a gambling man now. He stood up and offered his hand. Thorn took it with his grip firm despite his injury. Elias pulled him up and Thorn leaned heavily on Elias' shoulder. They began to walk, an odd three-legged beast stumbling through the dark. The progress was slow and agonizingly so. Every step was a struggle. Thorn was heavy and Elias was weak. They walked in silence for a long time. The only sound was their labored breathing and the crunch of snow. After a mile, Thorn spoke. He asked Elias why he fought. He asked what a blacksmith knew of politics and taxes. Elias thought for a moment. He said he didn't fight for taxes. He fought for the right to stand in his own shop and owe nothing to a king he had never seen. He fought for the silence in the forge where a man could think his own thoughts. Thorn listened quietly. He said that he fought because it was his duty, because his father had fought and his grandfather before him. He said that order was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Elias argued that order without freedom was just a prison. They debated as they walked, two men from different worlds bound together by the necessity of survival. The animosity between them began to thaw, replaced by a grudging respect. Thorn was not the monster Elias had imagined. He was a man trapped in a role he had been born into. And Elias was not the mindless rebel Thorn had been told of. He was a man of principle. They reached a clearing and Thorn stopped, gripping Elias' shoulder tight. He pointed to a ridge ahead. He whispered that there was a picket post there manned by Hessians. He said they were brutal men who took no prisoners. He told Elias they had to go around through the thicket. They moved off the path, fighting their way through the dense thorns that tore at their clothes. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "Halt!" A lantern flared to their right, blinding them. 3 Hessian soldiers stepped out from the trees, their muskets leveled. They were huge men with long mustaches and cold eyes. They shouted something in German and moved forward, gleaming bayonets. Elias reached for his knife, knowing it was useless against 3 muskets. He felt a hand on his chest pushing him back. It was Thorn. The captain straightened up, ignoring the pain in his leg. He barked an order in a loud, authoritative voice, using the tone of a man accustomed to command. He identified himself as Captain Thorn and demanded to know why they were threatening a superior officer. The Hessians hesitated, confused by the sight of a British officer leaning on a ragged civilian. The leader lowered his musket slightly and spoke in broken English, asking who the other man was. Thorn didn't blink. He looked at Elias with a look of utter contempt, a perfect mask of arrogance. He said that Elias was his prisoner, a rebel dog he had captured in the woods and was taken back for interrogation. He pointed to his broken leg and said the prisoner was serving as his crutch because his horse had bolted. The Hessian looked from Thorn to Elias. He walked closer, holding the lantern up to Elias' face. Elias kept his eyes down, playing the part of the defeated captive. The Hessian grunted and spat on the ground. He nodded to Thorn and stepped back, saluting. He offered to send a man to help. Thorn waved him off impatiently, saying he could handle 1 rebel and that they should return to their post and keep their eyes open. He ordered them to let them pass. The Hessians stepped aside and Elias and Thorn walked past them, their backs exposed to the guns. Elias felt a trickle of sweat run down his spine despite the cold. He waited for the shot, but it never came. When they were out of earshot, Elias let out a long breath. He looked at Thorn. He said that was a good lie. Thorn grimaced, the pain returning now that the adrenaline was fading. He said it was not a lie entirely. Elias was a rebel and he was technically a prisoner. Elias chuckled, a dry sound. He said that at that moment Thorn was the prisoner of the broken leg and Elias was the jailer. They continued on, the trust between them solidified by the encounter. They had saved each other. They were no longer just allies. They were comrades in the battle against the night. The snow began to fall harder, turning into a blizzard. The wind howled, whipping the trees into a frenzy. They needed shelter. Elias remembered a small cave near the river, a place he had found years ago when hunting. He guided them towards it, his sense of direction tested by the whiteout. They found it a shallow overhang of rock protected by a screen of pine boughs. They crawled inside out of the biting wind. It was small and dark, but it was dry. Elias gathered some dry leaves and twigs from the back of the cave and used his flint and steel to start a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, creating a temporary haven. They sat close to the fire, warming their frozen hands. Thorn took a flask from his pocket and offered it to Elias. It was brandy crying out with a fierce heat. Elias took a swig and handed it back. He felt the warmth spread through his chest. Thorn looked at him and asked about the letter. He said he knew Elias was hiding something, that he wasn't just a simple escapee. He asked what was so important that Elias would walk back into the fire for it. Elias looked into the flames. He realized that Thorn had saved his life. He owed him the truth, or at least part of it. He said it was a message from a dead man, a message that could end the war. Thorn looked at him quietly. He asked if it would end the war with a British victory or a rebel one. Elias said it would end it with the truth. Thorn nodded slowly. He said that truth was a rare commodity in war. He took another drink of brandy. He told Elias that he was tired. Tired of the killing, tired of the burning, tired of being a conqueror in a land that did not want him. He said he had a fiancée in London, a girl named Clara who wrote him letters about the gardens and the tea parties. He said he couldn't remember her face anymore. All he could see were the faces of the dead. Elias listened, feeling a strange kinship with this enemy. He realized that they were both pawns in a game played by kings and congressmen. They were the ones who bled while the others talked. The fire burned low and the cold crept back in. Thorn's eyes were heavy. He told Elias that he wouldn't make it much further. His leg was swelling and the fever was setting in. He said Elias should go on alone. Elias shook his head. He said they had a deal. He would get Thorn to safety. Thorn smiled a weak, genuine smile. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pocket watch. He handed it to Elias. He said if he didn't make it, Elias should take this. It would prove he was not a thief if he was caught. Elias pushed the watch back. He said Thorn would need it to tell the time when he got back to London. They settled down to sleep, taking turns keeping watch. The storm raged outside, a fury of wind and snow, but inside the cave there was a quiet peace. The unlikely alliance had held. Morning broke with a brilliant, blinding light. The storm had passed, leaving the world covered in a pristine blanket of white. Elias woke first. He checked Thorn's leg. It was bad hot to the touch, but the captain was alive. They ate the last of the bread Elias had scavenged. They crawled out of the cave, blinking in the sunlight. The landscape had changed, buried under 2 feet of snow, but Elias recognized the shape of the hills. They were close. The lightning-scarred oak was only a few miles away. He helped Thorn up and they began the march again. It was harder now with the snow dragging at their legs, but they moved with a silent rhythm. Step, drag, step, drag. They reached the top of a rise and looked down into a small valley. There it was. The oak tree stands tall and defiant, its white scar visible even from this distance. Elias felt his heart leap. The letter was there. But between them and the tree lay a camp. A British patrol had set up tents in the clearing right next to the oak. Smoke rose from their campfires and soldiers moved about, busy with the morning routine. Elias cursed. He dropped to the ground, pulling Thorn down with him. They lay in the snow watching. There were at least 20 men, too many to fight, too many to sneak past in daylight. Thorn looked at the camp and then at Elias. He saw the desperation in the blacksmith's eyes. He asked if the letter was worth dying for. Elias looked at him and said it was worth living for. Thorn nodded. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He said he had a plan. He said he would go down there alone. He was an officer. They would have to respect his rank. He would create a diversion, draw them away, or keep them occupied. While they were distracted, Elias could sneak in from the back and get the letter. Elias shook his head, saying it was too dangerous, that they would see he was injured and ask questions. Thorne smiled that sad, cynical smile. He said he was a British captain. He could order them to march into the river if he wanted to. He gripped Elias' arm. He said this was the only way. He said, "Go rebel, save your country. I will save my honor." Before Elias could stop him, Thorne stood up. He straightened his coat, brushed the snow from his shoulders, and began to limp down the hill towards the camp. He walked with his head held high, dragging his broken leg, a solitary splash of red against the white snow. Elias watched him go, his throat tight with emotion. He watched as Thorne reached the perimeter of the camp. He heard him shout an order. He saw the soldiers turn surprised. He saw the officer in charge run out. Thorne was gesturing, wildly pointing back towards the way they had come, yelling about a rebel ambush, about a hidden force. The soldiers grabbed their muskets and began to form up, looking towards the ridge where Thorne was pointing away from the tree. It was working. The camp was in chaos, focused on the imaginary threat. Elias didn't waste the chance. He moved. He circled around the ridge, keeping low, moving fast. He reached the back of the clearing near the oak tree. The soldiers were all gathered around Thorne, who was still shouting, giving a performance worthy of a stage actor. Elias crept to the tree. He found the roots. He dug. The ground was frozen hard, but he didn't care. He tore at the earth with his bare hands. He found the soft spot. He dug deeper. His fingers brushed the oilskin. He pulled it out. The packet was safe. He shoved it into his shirt against his skin. He looked back at the camp. Thorne was on the ground now, collapsed from the pain, surrounded by soldiers who were attending to him. He had done it. He had sacrificed his safety for a man who should have been his enemy. Elias wanted to run out there to help him, but he knew it would undo everything. Thorne had bought him this moment. He could not waste it. Elias turned and slipped back into the woods. He ran until he was far away, until the camp was just a memory. He stopped and looked back one last time. He raised his hand in a silent salute. "Goodbye, Captain," he whispered. He turned north again towards the future. He had the letter. He had his life. And he had a new understanding of the enemy. The unlikely alliance was over, but it had changed him. He was no longer just fighting a uniform. He was fighting for a world where men like him and men like Thorne didn't have to kill each other in the snow. The letter burned against his chest, a fire that would light the way forward. Elias Vance walked on, leaving footprints in the snow that would soon be filled, but carrying a memory that would last forever. The silence of the forest was a deception, a temporary holding of breath before the scream of the storm returned. Elias Vance moved through the trees with a desperate urgency, his legs pumping like the pistons of a steam engine he had once seen in a diagram but never in life. The memory of Captain Thorne lying in the snow surrounded by the redcoats was burned into his mind, a vivid painting of sacrifice that fueled his flight. He did not look back. To look back was to invite hesitation, and hesitation was death in these frozen woods. The letter, the cause of all this bloodshed and misery, sat against his chest, warm from his body heat, a constant reminder of his burden. He headed west, away from the river, away from the road, seeking the rugged terrain of the Watchung Mountains, where a man could disappear if he knew the land. But the British were not giving up so easily. Elias heard the sound that every fugitive dreads, the deep baying of hounds echoing off the canyon walls. They had brought dogs. The realization sent a spike of cold terror through his veins, colder than the wind that whipped his hair into his eyes. Dogs did not care about politics or diversions. They cared only for the scent, and Elias knew he reeked of fear and sweat, and the old smoke of the forge. He pushed himself harder, his boots tearing at the crust of the snow, slipping and sliding on the hidden ice beneath. The terrain was rising, becoming steeper and more treacherous. Great slabs of granite jutted out from the white slope like the bones of the earth, and the trees grew twisted and gnarled, their roots clutching the rock for dear life. Elias used his hands to pull himself up, scrambling over boulders and fallen logs, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his throat. He needed to break his trail. He knew the tricks of the trade, not from being a spy, but from being a boy who had hunted these woods for venison. He looked for water. A stream. Even a frozen one might mask his scent. He found a small creek on its surface, a sheet of ice, but he could hear the water gurgling beneath. He stepped onto the ice, moving carefully, testing the weight. It was held. He walked upstream, keeping to the center of the creek bed, hoping the ice would confuse the hounds. He walked for a mile with his boots sliding on the slick surface, his balance tested with every step. The baying of the dogs grew fainter, but he knew they were still there, relentless and hungry. He needed to get high. He needed to reach the ridgeline where the wind would scatter his scent and the rocky ground would leave no tracks. He climbed out of the creek bed and faced a steep incline, a wall of earth and snow that seemed to reach the sky. He began to climb, digging his fingers into the frozen soil using tree roots as handholds. It was grueling work. His muscles screamed in protest, his injured ribs throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. But he climbed. He climbed for the dead stranger. He climbed for Thorn. He climbed for the idea of a country that existed only in the minds of dreamers. As he neared the top, he heard a shout. It came from below, from the direction of the creek. He froze, pressing himself flat against the slope, burying his face in the snow. He listened. Voices. Men arguing. The dogs were confused, circling the spot where he had entered the water. But the soldiers were spreading out. They were professional hunters, and they knew the quarry had to go up. Elias waited until the voices drifted away. Then he resumed his climb, moving slower, now more deliberately. He reached the crest of the ridge and collapsed behind a cluster of laurel bushes. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the gray sky, watching the clouds race by. He was exhausted. He was hungry. He was alone, but he was not safe yet. He peeked over the edge of the ridge. Below him, the forest stretched out like a white ocean, the trees like waves frozen in time. He could see the tiny figures of the soldiers moving through the trees like red ants. They were fanning out, sweeping the woods with a terrifying efficiency. They were driving him. They were herding him towards something. Elias looked ahead to the west. The ridge ended in a sheer drop off a cliff that fell away into a deep ravine known as the Devil's Throat. It was a place locals avoided, a place of jagged rocks and swirling mists. The soldiers were pushing him towards the trap. They knew the terrain too. They knew that once he hit the cliff, he would have nowhere to go but back into their arms. Elias felt a surge of panic. He was cornered. He looked left and right. To the left, the ridge narrowed to a knife edge, guarded by a pair of sentries he could see in the distance. To the right, the slope was gentle, but it led back down towards the main road where the cavalry would be waiting. The only way was forward, towards the cliff. Elias stood up, crouching low, and moved towards the edge. He reached the precipice and looked down. It was a terrifying drop, 100 feet or more to the bottom, where the tops of the pine trees looked like spears waiting to impale him. The wind howled up from the canyon, tearing at his clothes, trying to pull him over. He stepped back, his head swimming. There was no way down. He was trapped. He heard the dogs again, closer now. They had found his trail where he left the creek. The soldiers were closing and shouting to each other, their voices full of the thrill of the chase. Elias looked around frantically. He saw a fallen tree, a massive pine that had toppled over the edge, its roots still clinging to the ridge, while its trunk leaned out over the abyss, resting against the cliff face at a steep angle. It was a bridge to nowhere, a ramp that led down into the void. But as Elias looked closer, he saw that the branches of the fallen pine tangled with the branches of another tree growing out of the canyon wall about 30 feet down. It was a desperate chance, a suicidal chance, but it was a chance. The soldiers broke through the tree line behind him. He heard the crack of a musket and a ball whizzed past his ear, chipping the rock near his foot. He didn't hesitate. He ran. He ran straight for the edge, straight for the fallen tree. He heard the soldiers scream at him to halt. He didn't stop. He jumped, landing on the trunk of the fallen pine, his boots slipping on the bark. He slid down the trunk, wrapping his arms around the rough wood, feeling the splinters tear at his coat. He gathered speed, sliding faster and faster towards the end of the tree, towards the open air. Just as he reached the end where the trunk snapped off into nothingness, he He let go and leaped. For a second he was flying suspended in the cold air, a wingless bird falling into the throat of the devil. He crashed into the branches of the second tree, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The branches whipped his face, tearing his skin, but he grabbed at them frantically, desperate for a hold. His hands closed around a thick limb and he swung wildly, his shoulder wrenching with the strain. He held on, dangling over the drop, his feet kicking at the empty air. He gasped for breath, staring down at the rocks below. He had made it. He was alive. Above him he could hear the soldiers shouting at the edge of the cliff. They were looking down, cursing, pointing. They fired a few shots, but the angle was bad and the balls flew harmlessly into the canyon. They wouldn't follow him. No sane man would make that jump. They assumed he had fallen to his death or that he was stuck and would freeze. They didn't know Elias Vance. They didn't know the strength of a man who forged iron. Elias pulled himself up onto the branch, straddling it like a horse. He sat there for a moment, shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash leaving him weak and nauseous. He looked up. The soldiers were leaving. They were pulling back, convinced that the chase was over. Elias let out a laugh, a ragged, hysterical sound that was swallowed by the wind. He was the fox who had flown, but he wasn't down yet. He had to descend the rest of the way. He moved carefully from branch to branch, climbing down the tree like a ladder. The bark was rough and cold, and his hands were numb, but he focused on the movement. Hand, foot, hand, foot. He reached the base of the tree and dropped the last few feet into the deep snow of the canyon floor. It was silent down here. The wind passed overhead, blocked by the high walls of the ravine. The air was still and bitterly cold. Elias stood up, brushing the snow from his coat. He checked the letter. It was still there, safe and dry. He looked around. The canyon was a narrow slit in the earth filled with shadows and ice. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stay here. The cold would kill him faster than the British. He began to walk, following the canyon floor, heading deeper into the wilderness. He walked for hours, his mind entering a trance state. He didn't think about the war. He didn't think about the danger. He thought about one step and then the next. He walked until the light began to fade, until the canyon walls turned from gray to black. He needed shelter. He couldn't sleep in the open tonight. He found a small recess in the rock wall, a shallow cave, hardly more than a dent, but it offered some protection. He crawled inside, curling into a ball. He had no fire. He had no food. He had only the clothes on his back and the will to live. He shivered, his teeth chattering in the darkness. He thought of his shop in Philadelphia, the warmth of the forge, the smell of the hot iron. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a different world. He was no longer that man. That man had died the moment he stepped into the boat. This new man was a creature of the wild, a survivor. He closed his eyes, but sleep was elusive. Every sound in the darkness was a threat. The crack of a branch, the hoot of an owl, the wind moaning in the trees. He lay there listening and waiting. He knew the British would assume he was dead, but he couldn't count on it. He had to be gone by dawn. He had to put miles between him and this canyon. He drifted into a fitful doze, his dreams filled with falling. He fell from the cliff, he fell from the sky, he fell into a pit of darkness. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. It was pitch black. He didn't know what time it was. He felt a presence. Something was watching him. He lay perfectly still with his hand on his knife. He heard a breathing sound, low and rhythmic. It was close, too close. He slowly turned his head. Two yellow eyes glowed in the darkness just outside the cave entrance. A wolf. It was sniffing the air, smelling the dried blood on his clothes. Elias stared at the eyes, holding the gaze. He didn't move. He didn't blink. The wolf growled, a low rumble that vibrated in Elias' chest. It was assessing him, deciding if he was prey or predator. Elias reached into his soul and found the anger and the rage at the injustice of it all. He channeled that anger into his eyes. He growled back, a guttural human sound that surprised even him. The wolf hesitated. It sensed that this was not a wounded deer. This was something dangerous. The beast turned and trotted away, vanishing into the night. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He was alive. He had faced the fall, he had faced the wolf, he had faced the army. He was still here. The escape was not just about running away. It was about refusing to die. It was about defying the odds. The sun began to rise, a pale gray light filtering down into the canyon. Elias crawled out of his hole, his joints stiff, his body aching. He stood up and looked at the path ahead. It led into the heart of the wilderness, into the unknown. He took a handful of snow and ate the cold liquid, soothing his parched throat. He adjusted his coat, checked the letter, and began to walk. He was leaving the world of men behind. He was entering the world of the wild. Chapter 8 was closing, but the story was far from over. He had escaped the trap, but he was now a prisoner of the winter. The forest stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. Elias Vance set his jaw and took the first step of the long journey into the wilderness. He was a small, dark figure against the vast whiteness of the snow, a lone spark of defiance in a frozen world. He walked with a limp, but he walked with purpose, for he carried the fire of liberty in his pocket, and he would not let it go out. Not today, not ever. The escape was complete, but the survival had just begun. The ravine known as the Devil's Throat lay behind him, a gaping maw of shadow and ice that he had cheated by the grace of a desperate leap and a fallen tree. Elias Vance moved forward into the true wilderness, a land that had never known the strike of an axe or the furrow of a plow. Here the trees were ancient sentinels, giants of pine and hemlock that towered hundreds of feet into the gray sky, their branches heavy with the weight of the winter. The snow was different here, deep and powdery, shifting under his boots like sand, making every step a labor of attrition. Elias was alone, in a way he had never been before. In the city, loneliness was a feeling of isolation amidst a crowd, but here loneliness was a physical presence, a vast, crushing silence that pressed against his eardrums and whispered that he was nothing more than a fleeting spark in an infinite cold. He checked his position by the moss on the trees and the faint position of the sun behind the clouds, keeping his course roughly northwest towards the distant mountains where the Continental Army was rumored to be hiding. He had no food. His stomach had long since stopped growling, settling instead into a dull, cramping ache that radiated outward to his limbs, making his fingers tremble and his knees weak. He ate snow, letting it melt in his mouth to trick his body into thinking it was being fed, but the cold water only lowered his core temperature further. He gnawed on the inner bark of a birch tree, the bitter taste filling his mouth but offering little sustenance. He was a man of the forge, used to the heavy heat of the fire and the solid resistance of iron, but now he was fighting a war against the air itself. The cold was a patient enemy. It did not charge with bayonets or fire muskets. It simply waited. It waited for him to stop, for him to rest, for him to close his eyes for just a moment. Elias knew this. He knew that to stop was to die, so he forced his legs to move one after the other, a mechanical rhythm driven by a will that was harder than any metal he had ever shaped. The forest was beautiful in a terrifying way. The white landscape stretched out in every direction, a pristine canvas that hid the cruelty of survival. He saw tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of a fox, the heavy bounding gait of a hare, and once the massive paw prints of a bear that had woken early from its slumber. He realized with a start that he was not the hunter here. He was an intruder, a soft, fleshy thing in a world of tooth and claw. He kept his knife close to his hand, often brushing the hilt for reassurance. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to pick up again, moaning through the treetops and sending showers of snow cascading down upon him. He needed shelter. He could not spend another night in the open, not with the temperature dropping and his strength fading. He scanned the landscape looking for a cave, a hollow log, anything that would offer a reprieve from the wind. He found nothing but trees and snow. He would have to build. He remembered stories the trappers used to tell in the tavern about building snow caves, about how the snow itself could be an insulator. He found a large drift that had piled up against the windward side of a fallen boulder. He dropped to his knees and began to dig. His hands were numb, His gloves frozen stiff, but he clawed at the snow, packing it down, hollowing out a space just big enough for his body. It was slow, exhausting work. He stopped frequently to blow on his fingers, trying to bring the blood back to the surface. When the hole was deep enough, he crawled inside, dragging a few pine boughs he had snapped off to lay on the freezing ground. He blocked the entrance with his pack, and more branches, leaving only a small hole for air. Inside it was dark and cramped, but out of the wind. The silence was absolute. Elias curled into a ball, shivering violently. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind would not shut down. He thought of the letter. It was a physical lump against his ribs. He wondered if it was worth this. Worth the hunger, the cold, the fear. He thought of his shop, the tools hanging on the wall, the smell of the coal. He wondered if he would ever see it again. He wondered if anyone would even know he was gone. He was a blacksmith, a man who made things that lasted. Horseshoes, hinged nails, things of iron. But here in the wilderness he felt like he was made of glass, fragile and easily broken. He drifted into a delirium, his dreams vivid and strange. He saw the colonel standing in the snow holding a lantern that burned with cold fire. He saw Caleb the traitor laughing as he ground wheat into snow. He saw Captain Thorne walking with a leg made of wood. He woke up with a start, gasping for air. The snow cave was pitch black. He didn't know if it was day or night. He felt a panic rising, a claustrophobic terror that he was buried alive. He kicked at the entrance, pushing the branches away. A shaft of gray light pierced the darkness. It was morning. He crawled out stiff and sore, his joints popping like dry twigs. The storm had passed, leaving a world of blinding white. The sun was out, a rare appearance, reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that hurt his eyes. He stood up and swayed dizzily. He was weaker today, much weaker. He needed food, real food. He looked around. The wilderness offered nothing. He began to walk again, his steps slow and stumbling. He reached a frozen stream, its surface a ribbon of white winding through the trees. He knelt down and broke the ice with the hilt of his knife, cupping the freezing water to his lips. It was clear and sharp, tasting of minerals and cold. He looked into the water and saw his reflection. A wild man stared back. His beard was matted with ice, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes burning with a feverish light. He hardly recognized himself. He was shedding the layers of civilization, shedding Elias the smith and becoming something else, something primal. He stood up and saw movement on the far bank. A deer, a doe standing perfectly still, watching him with large liquid eyes. She was close enough to hit with a stone if he had one, close enough to kill. Elias slowly reached for his knife. His hand shook. The doe did not move. She watched him without fear, as if she knew he was too weak to harm her. Elias looked at her, at the pulse beating in her throat, at the steam rising from her nostrils. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sadness. He could not kill her. Even if he could catch her, he didn't have the strength to butcher her, to make a fire to cook the meat. He was not a predator. He was a ghost passing through. He lowered his hand. The doe flicked her ears and turned, bounding away into the trees, leaving Elias alone once more. He watched her go, feeling a strange sense of peace. He had chosen mercy, or perhaps resignation. He continued his journey, following the stream. The water would lead somewhere, downstream to the river or upstream to the source. He chose upstream towards the mountains. The terrain grew rougher and the trees thicker. He stumbled over a root and fell face first into the snow. He lay there for a long time, the cold embracing him, numbing the pain. It would be so easy to stay here, to just close his eyes and let the snow cover him, to become part of the wilderness. He felt a warmth spreading through his limbs, a deceptive comfort that he knew was the herald of death. Sleep, the wind whispered. Rest, the trees murmured. Elias closed his eyes, but then he felt the letter. The sharp corner of the packet dug into his chest, a tiny point of pain that anchored him to the world of the living. He remembered the dead stranger's face. Liberty. The word echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a word. It was a promise that required him to get up. Elias gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. He screamed a raw sound that tore at his throat, a defiance against the silence. He stood up swaying like a drunkard. "I am iron," he whispered. "I am the anvil. I do not break." He forced one foot forward, then the other. He walked through the hallucinations that began to plague him. He saw his mother standing by a tree holding a basket of apples. He saw Washington riding a white horse through the drifts. He ignored them, focusing on the trees, the snow, and the stream. He found a patch of winter berries shriveled and frozen clinging to a bush. He ate them greedily, the tart taste exploding in his mouth. They were few, but they were something. He found a cluster of pine nuts hidden in a cone. He ate those too. He was a scavenger and a forager. He kept moving. The sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted. He needed fire. He had his flint and steel in his pocket, the tools of his trade. He gathered dead twigs from the lower branches of a spruce tree, keeping them dry under his coat. He found a sheltered spot under a rock overhang. He cleared the snow and made a small pile of shavings. He struck the flint against the steel. A spark flew, dying in the cold air. He struck again, and again. His hands were clumsy, numb. He struck until his knuckles bled. Finally, a spark caught in the dry tinder. A tiny glowing ember. Elias blew on it, gently nursing it like a newborn child. The smoke curled up. The flame flickered and grew. He added larger twigs, then branches. The fire crackled, pushing back the darkness and the cold. Elias sat before the flames. His hands held out the heat, searing his skin. He cried then, great racking sobs that shook his body. He cried for the pain, for the loneliness, for the sheer impossible difficulty of being alive. But as the fire burned, the tears dried. He stared into the flames, seeing the same orange glow he had seen in his forge every day for 30 years. Fire was life. Fire was civilization. As long as he had fire, he was not a beast. He sat through the night, feeding the flames, keeping the wilderness at bay. He took the letter out and looked at the wax seal, the hawk with the broken wing. He traced the design with his thumb. He spoke to the letter, telling it his story, telling it about the cold and hunger. It was his companion's confession. Morning came again, gray and bleak. Elias kicked snow over the fire, extinguishing the only friend he had. He stood up, his legs stiff, his body a map of aches, but he was alive. He had survived 2 nights in the wilderness. He climbed the bank of the stream and looked out. The trees were thinning. Ahead, the ground rose sharply into the foothills of the mountains, and there in the distance he saw a thin line of smoke rising into the sky. Not the smoke of a camp, but the steady chimney smoke of a homestead. It was miles away, a tiny smudge against the clouds, but it was hope. Elias fixed his eyes on that smoke. He didn't know who lived there. Friend or foe, patriot or loyalist. It didn't matter. It was a destination. He began to walk faster, ignoring the pain, finding a new reserve of strength. The wilderness had tried to kill him. It had thrown its worst at him. Cold, hunger, isolation, but he had walked through it. He was coming out the other side. He was thinner, harder, scarcer. The softness of the city was gone. He was honed like a blade. He moved through the last stretch of the deep woods, moving with a silent confidence. He stepped over logs, he ducked under branches, and he read the snow. He was no longer fighting the wilderness. He was moving with it. He reached the edge of the tree line and looked out at the valley below. The smoke was coming from a small cabin nestled in a grove of aspens. He didn't run. He walked slowly, deliberately. He checked his coat, ensuring the letter was hidden. He touched his knife. He was ready for whatever waited in that cabin. He was Elias Vance, the blacksmith, the spy and the survivor. He stepped out of the wilderness and into the open, his shadow stretching long before him on the snow, a dark figure returning from the land of the dead. The silence of the forest faded, replaced by the sound of the wind in the open valley. He took a deep breath of the cold air, tasting the wood smoke. He had made it. He had walked into the wilderness and he had walked back out. But the man who emerged was not the man who had entered. That man was gone, frozen in a snow cave somewhere back in the dark. This new man was forged in ice and fire, and he was ready for the next chapter of the war. Edge of the wilderness was not a mirage born of desperation, but a tangible gray ribbon curling into the cold sky from a chimney made of river stone. Elias approached the cabin with the caution of a wounded animal, his boots dragging in the snow and his eyes scanning the windows for the glint of a musket barrel or the movement of a curtain. The cabin was small and sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a silver gray, and it sat in the center of a small clearing, where the snow lay unbroken save for a path leading to a woodpile. It looked peaceful as a sanctuary in the middle of a war-torn land, but Elias had learned the hard way that peace was often a mask for treachery. He remembered the smile of Caleb the miller and the warmth of the betrayal at the border, so he did not walk to the door with his hand out in friendship, but with his hand gripping the hilt of his knife beneath his coat. He reached the heavy wooden door and paused, listening. He heard no voices, no barking dogs, only the low murmur of a fire and the rhythmic scratching of a quill on paper. He knocked 3 times, a hollow sound that seemed too loud in the stillness of the valley. The scratching stopped. A chair scraped against a wooden floor. Footsteps approached slowly and shuffling. The door opened with a groan of dry hinges, revealing an old man holding a candle, though it was broad daylight. He was a creature of parchment and ink, with thinning white hair that stood up in tufts and spectacles perched on the end of a long nose. He wore a faded coat that had once been fine velvet, but was now patched and worn, and his eyes were magnified by the thick lenses appearing huge and watery. He looked at Elias not with fear, but with a mild curiosity, as if Elias were a rare bird that had landed on his doorstep. He asked in a voice that cracked with age if Elias was the firewood man. Elias stared at him, blinking against the exhaustion that threatened to pull him down. He said he was not the firewood man, but a traveler who had lost his way in the storm. The old man squinted, peering closer at Elias' ragged clothes and his face, which was gaunt and burned by the wind. He stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for Elias to enter. He said that all who are lost are welcome here, for he too was lost in his own way. Elias stepped inside, and the warmth hit him like a physical blow, a thick enveloping heat that smelled of old paper and dried herbs and wood smoke. The room was a chaotic library. Books were stacked in teetering piles on every surface. Papers covered the floor like fallen leaves, and a large desk in the center was buried under maps and charts. It was the den of a scholar, a place where the war outside was just a distant rumor. The old man introduced himself as Isaac, a student of history and the stars who had retreated to this valley to escape the madness of the world. He directed Elias to a chair by the fire and brought him a bowl of broth and a heel of stale bread. Elias ate with a savage hunger, his hands trembling as he lifted the spoon. The broth was hot and salty, and it felt like life itself flowing back into his veins. Isaac sat opposite him, watching him eat, his large eyes filled with a quiet intelligence. He didn't ask Elias his name or his business or which side he fought for. He simply waited. When Elias had finished, he sat back the fire, warming his frozen bones. He looked at Isaac and realized that this man was safe. He was not a soldier. He was not a spy. He was just a man who loved books more than battles. Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming need to share the burden he had been carrying. He reached into his coat and pulled out the packet. The oilskin was stained and battered, but the seal was intact. He placed it on the table amongst the clutter of Isaac's papers. He said he had carried this from Philadelphia, from a dead man, to a destination he didn't know. He said he was tired of running blind. He said he needed to know if it was worth the blood. Isaac looked at the packet, his interest piqued. He picked it up, handling it with the reverence of a man who respected the written word. He examined the seal, the hawk with the broken wing. He hummed a low note under his breath. He said he knew this mark. It belonged to a society of men who believed in secret men who communicated in shadows. He looked at Elias and asked if he was prepared to know the truth, for truth was a heavy burden, often heavier than the lie. Elias nodded. He said he had nothing left to lose. Isaac took a small knife from his desk and carefully slid it under the wax seal, breaking it with a sharp crack. He unfolded the letter. Elias leaned forward, his heart pounding. The paper was thick and expensive cream-colored vellum, but as Isaac spread it out, Elias felt a pang of disappointment. The page was covered in gibberish. Lines of random letters and numbers, senseless strings of characters that meant nothing. XJK 7 Lop 94 RRE. It was chaos. Elias slumped back in his chair. He said it was a code. He said it was useless. Isaac smiled a slow, knowing smile. He adjusted his spectacles and leaned over the paper, his nose almost touching the ink. He said that nothing is useless to a mind that knows how to look. He said that chaos is just an order that hasn't been understood yet. He began to mutter to himself, tracing the lines with a stained finger. He went to his shelves and pulled down several thick volumes, blowing the dust off them. He opened a book on mathematics and another on ancient ciphers. He told Elias that there were many ways to hide a message. The Caesar shift, where letters are moved a certain number of places down the alphabet. The Wigner square, which uses a keyword to scramble the text. The book cipher, where the numbers correspond to pages and words in a specific book. They worked through the afternoon, the sun moving across the floor while the fire crackled in the hearth. Elias found himself drawn into the puzzle. He was a blacksmith, and blacksmithing was about patterns. It was about structure and sequence. He looked at the blocks of letters and started to see repetitions. He pointed out to Isaac that the combination XJK appeared at the beginning of every third line. Isaac nodded excitedly, saying that was the key to the heartbeat of the code. They tried shifting the letters. Nothing. They tried using the date as a key. Nothing. The frustration began to mount. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes, but inside, the world had shrunk to that single piece of paper. Elias stared at the seal against the hawk with the broken wing. He thought of the dead stranger in his shop. He thought of the phrase the man had whispered, liberty. He told Isaac to try the word liberty as the keyword. Isaac dipped his quill in ink and wrote the word out above the first line of the code. He began to transcribe matching letters. L to X, I went to J, it didn't work. The result was still nonsense. Elias frowned. He thought back to the tavern, to the man named Silas. He thought of the phrase Silas had used, the hawk that flies too close to the sun. He thought of the book he had seen on the stranger's body before he buried him in a small pocket Bible. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now he remembered it was open to a specific page. The book of Isaiah. He told Isaac this. Isaac's eyes lit up. He scrambled to a pile of books and pulled out a battered leather Bible. He asked Elias if he remembered the chapter. Elias closed his eyes, searching his memory, visualizing the scene in the forge, the blood on the floor of the open book. Chapter 40, he whispered. Verse 31. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. Isaac turned the pages frantically. He found the verse. He counted the words. He looked at the numbers in the letter. He said this was it. It was a variation of a book cipher combined with a substitution. The numbers corresponded to the letters in the verse, and those letters formed a key for the rest of the message. It was brilliant and complex, designed to baffle anyone who didn't know the specific context. Isaac began to decode his quill, scratching furiously now. Elias watched the letters forming words and the words forming sentences. The gibberish was melting away, revealing the terrible truth underneath. Slowly, the message emerged. It was not a list of troop movements. It was not a map of supply lines. It was a letter addressed to General Howe, the British commander. But it was written by someone inside the Continental Army, a traitor of the highest order. Elias read the words as they appeared, his blood running cold. The letter detailed a plan to betray General Washington. It gave the exact location of the secret headquarters where Washington was planning his winter campaign. It listed the strength of his guards, the timing of the watch changes, and the location of his private quarters. But it was worse than that. The letter claimed that a group of officers loyal to the crown had been planted within Washington's inner circle, men who were trusted implicitly. These men were waiting for a signal. The signal was to be the delivery of this very letter confirming that the British forces were in position to strike. The attack was scheduled for December the 26th, the day after Christmas, the day the army would be recovering from their celebrations, assuming they were safe in the winter lull. It was a massacre in the making, a decapitation strike that would end the revolution in a single night. Elias sat back stunned. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. He held the fate of the entire war in his hands. This wasn't just intelligence. It was the death warrant of George Washington. Isaac put down his quill, his face pale. He looked at Elias and said that this changes everything. He said that history was balancing on the edge of a knife. He asked Elias what he would do. Elias looked at the paper, the ink still wet. He felt a surge of rage, a hot fire that burned away the last of his exhaustion. He thought of all the men who had died for this cause. He thought of the suffering he had seen from the starving soldiers and the burning towns. And he thought of the traitor, whoever he was, sitting in Washington's camp smiling and plotting murder. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly. He said he had to go. He said he had to get to Washington before the 26th. Isaac looked at the clock on the mantel. It was late afternoon on the 23rd. He had 3 days. 3 days to cross the rest of the wilderness to find the army to convince them of the truth. It was impossible, but Elias Vance did not know the meaning of impossible anymore. He was the man who had crossed the Delaware in a sinking boat, who had escaped Fort Lee, who had survived the Devil's Throat. He folded the letter carefully, not sealing it this time, but placing it inside his shirt against his skin. He felt its heat and its power. Isaac stood up and went to a chest in the corner. He pulled out a heavy woolen cloak lined with fur and a pair of sturdy snowshoes. He handed them to Elias. He also gave him a small compass and a bag of dried meat and hardtack. He said he could not fight, but he could equip the warrior. He told Elias to follow the stars, to keep the North Star on his right shoulder. He told him that the army was rumored to be camped near McConkey's Ferry, preparing for something. Elias took the items, thanking the old man with a grip of his hand. He asked Isaac why he helped. Isaac smiled that sad, wise smile. He said that he read history, but he didn't want to see it end in darkness. He said that some stories need a hero and some heroes need a coat. Elias walked to the door. He looked back at the warm room, the fire, the books, and the safety. He knew he was leaving it for the cold and the danger, but he also knew he was leaving it with a purpose. He was no longer just a messenger carrying a blind packet. He was the keeper of the secret code. He knew the enemy's plan. He held the ace of spades. He opened the door and the cold wind rushed in, swirling around his legs. He stepped out into the snow, strapping the snowshoes to his boots. They felt awkward at first, but soon he found a rhythm, a sliding gait that allowed him to move quickly over the deep drifts. He headed west towards the setting sun, towards the river, towards the army. The knowledge of the code burned in his mind. December 26th. It was a deadline, a ticking clock. He imagined Washington sitting in his tent, unaware that the knife was already at his throat. Elias moved faster, pushing his body to the limit. The wilderness was no longer just an obstacle, it was a race track. He ran through the trees, the branches whipping his face. He ran through the night, guided by the compass and the stars. He didn't stop to sleep. He ate the dried meat as he walked, chewing rhythmically. He let his mind work on the problem. Who was the traitor? The letter was signed only with a symbol, a snake coiled around a sword. It was a clue, but he didn't have the answer. He would have to find it when he got there, if he got there. The secret code had unlocked the mystery of the letter, but it had also unlocked a new level of fear. He wasn't just fighting the British anymore. He was fighting a shadow within the army itself, a shadow that could be anyone, a general, a colonel, a trusted aide. Elias realized that delivering the letter might not be enough. He might have to identify the traitor himself. He might have to become the spy catcher. The thought was daunting, but he pushed it down. First, he had to survive the journey. He crossed frozen creeks and climbed snowy ridges. He saw the tracks of wolves, but he didn't care. He was the wolf now. He was on the hunt. The code had given him power, the power of truth, and he would wield that truth like a hammer. He would smash the plot, he would save the general, he would save the revolution, or he would die trying in the snow. The night deepened, the stars shining like diamonds in the black velvet sky. Elias Vance moved on a solitary figure, carrying the weight of a nation in his pocket. The secret code was broken, but the silence of the winter remained, waiting to be shattered by the sound of battle. He ran on into the dark, his breath a steam engine to resolve, his heart a drumbeat of war. He was coming. The fox was awake, and he was coming to save the day. The snowshoes Isaac had given him were a blessing, and a curse, allowing him to float over the deep drifts that would have swallowed a man whole, but demanding a wide-legged gait that strained muscles he didn't know he possessed. Elias Vance moved through the white landscape like a ghost, haunting the edges of the world, his breath trailing behind him in a frozen plume that marked his passage through the silent woods. The urgency of the secret code burned in his mind, hotter than the sun that was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long blue shadows across the valley. December the 26th. The date hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. He had 2 days, perhaps less, to reach the Continental Army and deliver the news that would either save the revolution or doom it to a bloody grave. He checked the compass Isaac had pressed into his hand, the needle floating in its casing, pointing the way north and east towards the river, towards the crossing points where Washington was rumored to be. But the path Elias had chosen, the most direct route through the foothills, took him through a territory that held a different kind of weight for him. It was the land of his childhood, the rolling hills and fertile valleys where he had run barefoot in the summers before the soot of the city had stained his skin, and the weight of the hammer had broadened his shoulders. He recognized the shape of the ridges, the way the creek wound through the grove of hemlocks, and the specific tilt of the old stone walls that marked the boundaries of the farms. It was a landscape of memory, a place where the war had always seemed like a distant thunder that would never break over these quiet fields. He felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and dread as he crested a hill and looked down into the valley known as Miller's Hollow. It was a small settlement, a cluster of a dozen houses, a church and a general store where he had bought his first pocket knife with a coin earned from picking apples. He had not been back in years, not since he had established his forge in Philadelphia, but the pull of the place was a strong tether to a simpler time. He hoped to find a fresh horse there, or at least a warm meal, and a moment of rest before the final push to the river. He imagined the face of old man Miller who ran the store, a grumpy soul with a kind heart who would surely have news of the army. Elias picked up his pace, sliding down the slope, the snowshoes hissing against the crust. But as he descended, the wind shifted, blowing up from the valley floor and carrying with it a scent that stopped him in his tracks. It was not the comforting smell of wood smoke from a chimney, the smell of hickory and maple that promised a hearth and a home. It was a darker smell, acrid and oily, the smell of burning thatch and scorched timber, the smell of destruction. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach, tighter than the hunger that had plagued him for days. He scanned the valley, his eyes narrowing against the glare. There was no movement, no cattle in the fields, no smoke rising in lazy spirals from the chimneys. Instead, there was a haze, a low-hanging gray pall that obscured the village like a shroud. He began to run, his awkward gait forgotten in the sudden surge of adrenaline. He tore through the last line of trees and stumbled onto the main road that led into the hollow. The road was churned into a mire of mud and slush, marked by the heavy wheels of wagons and the hoofprints of many horses. Fresh tracks, too many for a village this size. Elias followed them, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. He reached the edge of the settlement, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The village of Miller's Hollow was gone. It was not just damaged or looted, it was erased. The houses were nothing but blackened skeletons, charred beams reaching up to the sky like the ribs of great beasts picked clean by vultures. The church, The white clapboard structure where he had sat on hard wooden pews listening to sermons about mercy and grace was a pile of ash. The steeple toppled and smashed into the snow. The silence was absolute. No dogs barked. No chickens scratched in the dirt. No children shouted. It was the silence of the grave. Elias walked forward, his snowshoes crunching loudly on the frozen mud, a sound that seemed like a desecration in this place of death. He passed the remains of the blacksmith shop, the anvil sitting amidst the rubble, a silent brother to his own trade. He saw the tools scattered and broken, the bellows slashed and burned. It was a personal affront, a destruction of the means of creation. He walked to where the general store had stood. The front wall had collapsed, revealing the interior, which was gutted by fire. Tins of goods were blackened and burst, their contents spilling out into the snow. Elias stepped over a fallen beam, the heat still radiating faintly from the wood, indicating that the fire had been recent. Yesterday perhaps, or even this morning. He looked around, desperately searching for a sign of life. A survivor, a witness, anyone. But there were only the tracks of the soldiers leading out of the village to the east towards the river. The British, or the Hessians. It didn't matter which uniform they wore. The result was the same. They had swept through here like a plague, taking what they wanted and burning what they couldn't carry, leaving nothing but winter and ash for the people. Elias walked towards the house at the end of the lane, the house where his aunt had lived. He remembered the apple tree in the front yard, the one that produced the sweetest fruit in the county. The tree was chopped down, its trunk severed and left to rot in the snow, a senseless act of vandalism. The house was a ruin, the roof caved in, the windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Elias stopped at the gate, his hand resting on the charred wood. He felt a grief so profound it threatened to bring him to his knees. This was not a military target. This was not a fort or a supply depot. These were farmers and tradesmen families. They were his people. He pushed open the gate and walked up the path, his eyes stinging not from the smoke, but from tears he refused to shed. He stepped onto the porch, or what was left of it, and looked inside. The furniture was smashed and the bedding ripped apart. He saw a small wooden horse lying in the corner, a toy he had carved for his cousin's son years ago. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the rough lines of the wood. It was scorched black on one side. He squeezed it until his knuckles turned white, until the wood bit into his palm. He realized then that the war he had been fighting, the war of secret letters and hidden codes, was only one layer of the conflict. This was the reality. This was the price of the king's order. It was not just about taxes or representation. It was about the right to live in peace without fear of the torch and the bayonet. Elias walked out of the house and stood in the center of the ruined village. The sun was setting, now turning the sky a blood red that reflected off the snow and the blackened ruins, creating a scene from hell itself. He felt a change taking place within him. The fear that had dogged him since Philadelphia, the hesitation, the doubt, it was all burning away in the heat of his anger. He was no longer just a messenger. He was a witness. He was the carrier of the memory of this place. He looked at the tracks leading east. He knew where they were going. They were heading to join the main force to prepare for the attack on Washington. They were going to do to the army what they had done to this village. Burn it, crush it, leave it in ashes. Elias put the wooden horse in his pocket next to the letter. He adjusted his pack, tightening the straps. He checked his knife. He looked at the snowshoes which had carried him here. He would need them. He turned his face towards the east, towards the river, towards the enemy. He did not run this time. He walked with a cold, deliberate purpose. His fatigue was gone, replaced by a dark energy that fueled his every step. He was leaving the ashes of his home behind, but he was taking the fire with him. He walked out of Miller's Hollow, leaving the ghosts to their silence. He followed the tracks of the destroyers. He moved through the darkening woods, his eyes adjusting to the night. He was not afraid of the dark anymore. He was dark. He was the retribution that was coming for them. The miles melted away under his stride. He crossed frozen brooks where the water gurgled beneath the ice like a trapped voice. He He climbed ridges where the wind howled and tried to push him back. He ignored it all. He thought only of the code. XJK-7, the traitor, the attack, the village. It was all connected to a web of malice that he had to cut. He walked for hours fueled by hate and duty. Sometime past midnight he saw a glow in the distance. Not the glow of a burning village, but the campfire of a picket. He slowed down, moving into the trees, using the shadows as a cloak. He crept closer. It was a small checkpoint guarding a bridge over a tributary stream. 3 soldiers sat around a fire, warming their hands and laughing. They were Hessians wearing the tall brass-plated caps and blue coats. They were eating and drinking and passing a bottle around. Elias watched them from the darkness. He saw a pile of loot near their tent. Silver candlesticks, blankets, a sack of flour, stolen from the village, stolen from the dead. Elias felt the handle of his knife. It was cold and hard. He knew he should go around. He should avoid the fight to preserve the mission. Washington needed the letter, not a dead messenger. But the anger was a living thing inside him, demanding payment. He looked at the bridge. It was the only way across for miles. If he went around, it would add hours to his journey. Hours he didn't have. He had to cross. And to cross, he had to go through them. He devised a plan. A blacksmith's plan. Simple, direct, brutal. He picked up a heavy stone the size of a cannonball. He moved to the edge of the trees about 20 yards from the fire. He threw the stone with all his might, aiming for the thicket of dry bushes on the far side of the camp. The stone crashed into the brush with a loud crack, snapping branches. The soldiers jumped up, reaching for their muskets. They shouted to each other, peering into the darkness towards the noise. One of them, the leader, barked an order, and 2 of the men moved towards the bushes, their bayonets leveled, leaving only one by the fire. This was the moment. Elias moved. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He burst from the trees on the opposite side, rushing the lone guard. The snow muffled his approach until he was 5 paces away. The soldier turned, his eyes widening in shock, seeing the wild figure charging out of the night. He tried to raise his musket, but he was too slow. Elias slammed into him, tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of the soldier. Elias didn't use the knife. He used his fist, striking the man on the jaw with the force of a hammer blow. The soldier went limp. Elias grabbed the man's musket, checking the prime. It was loaded. He rolled behind a log just as the other 2 soldiers turned back, alerted by the scuffle. They saw their comrade down and raised their weapons, firing blindly into the camp. The balls whistled over Elias' head, thudding into the trees. Elias rested the musket on the log, taking aim. He was not a marksman, but at this range he couldn't miss. He fired. The lead ball struck the nearest Hessian in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the snow, screaming. The 3rd soldier, the leader, hesitated. He saw the muzzle flash and he saw his men down. He charged, screaming a war cry, his bayonet gleaming in the firelight. Elias dropped the empty musket and stood up, drawing his knife. He waited. The soldier lunged, thrusting the blade towards Elias' chest. Elias sidestepped, the move he had practiced in his mind 1,000 times since the forge. He grabbed the barrel of the musket with his left hand, guiding it past him, and stepped in close. He drove the knife upward. It was over in a second. The soldier gasped and fell. Elias stood over him, breathing hard, the steam rising from his body. He looked around. The camp was his. He checked the man he had punched. He was unconscious but alive. The one with the shoulder wound was moaning. Elias didn't kill them. He wasn't a butcher. He left them there in the snow. He took the bottle of rum from near the fire and took a long swig of the alcohol, burning his throat. He took a hunk of bread from their supplies. He looked at the pile of loot. He saw a shawl, a blue wool shawl that looked like one his aunt used to wear. He picked it up and wrapped it around his neck, a talisman. He crossed the bridge, leaving the carnage behind. He didn't look back. He had drawn blood. He had crossed the line from spy to soldier. He felt lighter now. The burden of the village was shared. He had exacted a small price, but the big debt remained. The colonel, the traitor, the British army, they all still had to pay. Elias moved on into the night, his pace relentless. He was getting closer. He could feel the river pulling him. He could smell the water. He checked the stars. He was on course. He thought of Isaac and his books. He thought of Thorn and his honor. He thought of the dead boy in the coal bin. They were all walking with him now, a legion of ghosts marching on the road to victory. He reached the top of a high ridge, just as the first hint of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky. He looked down, and there it was, the Delaware River, a dark ribbon of churning water choked with white ice flowing between snow-covered banks, and on the far side, barely visible in the gloom, he saw the flicker of campfires. Hundreds of them. The Continental Army. He had found them. He dropped to his knees in the snow, whispering a prayer of thanks. He was here. But the river was wide and the ice was treacherous, and he was on the wrong side. He had to cross again. But that was a problem for the next hour. For now he just watched the fires of hope, the fires of the revolution. He touched the letter in his pocket. "Hold on, General," he whispered. "I'm coming, and I'm bringing the devil with me." The ashes of his home were behind him, but the fire was in his blood. Elias Vance stood up and began the descent to the river. The final leg of the journey had begun. He was tired, he was battered, he was bleeding, but he was unbroken. He was the iron that had passed through the fire, and he was ready to strike. The sun broke the horizon, painting the river in gold and crimson. A new day, a day of destiny. Elias walked into the light, leaving his shadow behind him. The silent war was about to become very loud. The river was a living beast of black water and grinding white ice that separated Elias Vance from the salvation of the Continental Army and the deliverance of the message that burned against his chest like a brand. He stood on the Jersey shore, hidden in the reeds, his breath misting in the frigid air, watching the distant campfires on the Pennsylvania side flicker like dying stars in the vast darkness of the winter morning. It was December the 24th, a day that should have been filled with the anticipation of Christmas, but was instead filled with the grim reality of war and the gathering storm that threatened to swallow the revolution whole. Elias knew he could not swim the river, for the current was too strong and the ice too sharp, and to attempt it would be to surrender to the cold death that had stalked him. For days, he needed a boat, but the banks on this side were patrolled by British dragoons, and any vessel found had been burned or seized. He scanned the water looking for a patrol from the American side, for he knew Washington kept a close watch on the river to prevent a surprise crossing by the enemy. Hours passed as he waited for the cold seeping through his boots and numbing his toes until he could no longer feel them. He ate the last of the hardtack Isaac had given him, the dry biscuit turning to dust in his mouth. He thought of the village of Miller's Hollow, of the ashes, and the silence and the anger kept him warm. Finally, near mid-morning, he saw it. A longboat moving slowly through the ice floes, piloted by 4 men in ragged blue coats struggling against the current. They were keeping close to the western bank, but the drift was pushing them towards the center. Elias knew this was his chance, perhaps his only chance. He stood up from the reeds and stepped out onto a shelf of ice that extended over the water. He didn't shout, for sound carried far over water and could alert the British patrols behind him. Instead, he took the blue shawl he had taken from the Hessian camp, the one that reminded him of his aunt, and waved it frantically above his head. The blue wool caught the wind, snapping like a flag against the gray sky. The men in the boat did not see him at first, their heads bowing against the wind, their attention focused on the treacherous ice. Elias waved harder, his arm burning with the effort. He took a risk, then a calculated gamble. He pulled the pistol he had taken from the Hessian from his belt and fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the river, shattering the silence. The men in the boat looked up instantly, their muskets raised, scanning the shoreline. Elias stood perfectly still, his arms raising, the blue shawl hanging from his hand. He was a sitting duck if there were British nearby, but he had to be seen. The boat turned slowly, fighting the ice, heading towards him. As they got closer, Elias could see their faces. They were hard, weather-beaten faces framed by beards and wrapped in scarves. They looked at him with suspicion, their weapons trained on his chest. The boat crunched against the ice shelf, and the man in the bow, a corporal with a scarred nose, shouted, asking who he was and what business he had on the enemy shore. Elias lowered his arms, slowly keeping his hands open. He called out that he was a friend from Philadelphia, carrying intelligence for the general. The corporal spat into the water and said they had enough spies and enough lies, and told him to turn back. Elias stepped to the edge of the ice, the dark water swirling inches from his boots. He said he had the code. He said he knew about the snake and the sword. The corporal's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a glance with the steersman. He gestured for Elias to jump. Elias didn't hesitate. He leaped from the ice, landing heavily in the bottom of the boat, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The boat rocked violently, and the men cursed, but they didn't throw him back. They turned the boat around, pushing off from the shore and rowing hard back towards Pennsylvania. The crossing was a nightmare of crushing ice and freezing spray. The river seemed angry, fighting their progress every inch of the way. Elias huddled in the bow, shivering uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on the approaching camp. He saw rows of tents pitched in the snow, soldiers huddled around fires, horses tethered to trees, their heads hanging low. It was a scene of misery and desperation. These were the men who were supposed to defeat the greatest empire on earth. They looked more like a colony of beggars. The boat grounded on the muddy bank, and Elias climbed out, his legs stiff and uncooperative. He was immediately surrounded by guardsmen with rags wrapped around their feet instead of boots, their eyes hollow with hunger. They prodded him with bayonets, asking for the password. Elias shook his head, saying he had no password, only a letter for Washington. They laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. They said everyone wanted to see the general, and that the general was busy trying to keep the army from starving. A sergeant stepped forward, a big man with a kindly face that was etched with worry. He asked Elias his name. Elias told him. The sergeant asked for the letter. Elias shook his head again, clutching his coat. He said it was for the general's eyes only. He said it was a matter of life and death. The sergeant looked at him, studying his face, his ragged clothes, and the determination in his eyes. He decided to take a chance. He ordered 2 privates to escort Elias to the intelligence tent. They marched him through the camp, and Elias saw the true state of the army. He saw men without coats shivering in the snow. He saw the sick lying on pallets of straw, coughing up blood. He saw the lack of food and the lack of hope. It was a graveyard of ambition, but amidst the misery he also sensed something else. A resolve, a quiet, stubborn refusal to quit. These men were suffering, but they were still here. They had not run. Elias felt a surge of pride. He was one of them. He reached a large tent near the center of the camp where a flag whipped in the wind. The guards pushed him inside. The tent was warm and heated by a portable stove. A table in the center was covered with maps and papers. A man stood there with his back to the door, looking at a map of New Jersey. He wore the uniform of a colonel, blue with buff facings, and his hair was powdered and tied back in a neat queue. He turned as Elias entered. He was a handsome man with sharp features and cold, intelligent eyes. He looked at Elias with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. He asked the sergeant what this was. The sergeant saluted and said, "This man claims to have urgent intelligence from Philadelphia, sir." The colonel walked around the table, his boots clicking on the wooden floorboards that had been laid down. Over the mud, he stopped in front of Elias, looking him up and down as if inspecting a horse. He asked Elias where he had stolen the coat. Elias stood tall, meeting the officer's gaze. He said he was given the coat by a patriot named Isaac. He said he had traveled from the city through the wilderness to deliver a warning. The colonel held out a gloved hand. He said he would take the message and determine if it was worth the general's time. Elias hesitated. The letter warned of a traitor in the inner circle. He didn't know this colonel. He didn't know if he could trust him. He looked at the colonel's eyes, searching for a sign. The colonel smiled, a thin, humorless smile that reminded Elias of the British officer at Fort Lee. He said, Surely you don't think you can just waltz in to see General Washington, do you? He said the general is planning a battle. He has no time for stray blacksmiths. Elias felt a warning bell ring in his mind. How did the colonel know he was a blacksmith? He hadn't said it. The sergeant hadn't said it. Elias took a half step back, his hand going to his knife under his coat. He asked who the colonel was. The officer straightened his coat and said he was Colonel Reed, the adjutant general. Elias' mind raced. Reed was a high-ranking officer trusted by Washington, but the letter said the traitor was trusted. The letter said the traitor knew everything. Elias decided to test him. He said the message concerns a hawk with a broken wing. Reed's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered just for a second. He said he knew nothing of hawks, only of vultures. He demanded the letter again, his voice losing its smooth veneer and becoming hard and commanding. Elias shook his head. He said he would wait. He said he would sleep in the snow if he had to, but he would give the letter to no one but Washington. Reed stared at him, his face flushing with anger. He ordered the guards to search the prisoner and seize the paper. The guards stepped forward uncertainly. They were simple soldiers, and Elias' intensity scared them. Elias backed against the tent pole, drawing his knife. He shouted that he would burn the letter before he let them take it. He shouted that the army was in danger, that there was a snake in the tent. The commotion drew attention. The flap of the tent opened and another man entered. He was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall, with a heavy build and a booming voice. He wore the uniform of an artillery officer. It was Henry Knox. He looked at the scene, the drawn knife, the angry colonel, and the frightened guards. He roared, asking what in God's name was going on. Reed turned his composure, returning instantly. He said this madman was threatening the guards and refusing to hand over intelligence. Knox looked at Elias. He saw desperation, he saw exhaustion, he saw the fire. He walked over, pushing the guards aside gently but firmly. He looked down at Elias, his face open and honest. He asked Elias to put the knife away. He said, "They were all on the same side here." Elias looked at Knox. He had heard of him, the bookseller turned soldier, the man who had dragged the cannons from Ticonderoga. He lowered the knife but didn't sheath it. He told Knox he needed to see Washington. He said the 26th was the date. Knox went still. He looked at Reed, then back at Elias. He asked, "What about the 26th?" Elias whispered that it was the day the music stopped. It was a phrase from the decoded letter, a code within a code. Knox's eyes widened. He knew something. He nodded slowly. He told Reed to stand down. He said he would take personal responsibility for this man. Reed protested, saying it was against protocol, that the general must not be disturbed. Knox ignored him. He put a massive hand on Elias' shoulder and guided him out of the tent, leaving Reed staring after them with a look of cold fury. Knox led Elias through the camp towards a stone farmhouse that served as the headquarters. He walked quickly, his stride long and purposeful. He asked Elias in a low voice how he knew that date. Elias said he had the letter. He said the traitor was close. Knox stopped just outside the farmhouse. He looked Elias in the eye. He said that if Elias was lying, if this was a trick, he would kill him with his own hands. Elias nodded, accepting the terms. They entered the house. It was a hive of activity, officers rushing back and forth, carrying orders and maps. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Knox led him to a door at the back, guarded by 2 sentries. He nodded to them and they stepped aside. Knox opened the door and gestured for Elias to enter. The room was small and simply furnished. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. At a desk in the corner sat a man writing by the light of a single candle. He was tall and imposing even while seated. He wore a simple blue coat with his white hair tied back. He looked up as they entered. It was him, George Washington. The face was familiar from the prints Elias had seen, but it was more human, more tired than any picture could capture. There were deep lines of worry etched around his mouth, and his eyes were heavy with the weight of the world. He put down his quill and looked at Knox, then at Elias. He asked what was the meaning of this interruption. Knox stepped forward and introduced Elias, saying he brought news that could not wait. Washington looked at Elias, his gaze piercing and direct. He didn't speak, he simply waited. Elias stepped forward, his legs trembling not from fear but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the packet. He placed it on the desk. He said it was from Philadelphia. He said it was intercepted from a dead courier. He said it was written by a man who sat at the general's table. Washington picked up the letter. He looked at the broken seal. He unfolded the paper and saw the code and the translation Isaac had written in the margins. He began to read. The room was silent save for the crackling of the fire. Elias watched Washington's face. He saw the color drain from the general's cheeks. He saw the jaw tighten. He saw the hands clench into fists. Washington read the letter twice, then he looked up. His eyes were no longer tired. They were blazing with a cold fury. He asked Elias who had decoded this. Elias told him about Isaac, about the Bible verse. Washington nodded slowly. He looked at the signature of the snake and the sword. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that was beginning to fall again. The storm was gathering outside, but the storm inside the room was far more dangerous. Washington spoke, his voice low and dangerous. He said that this letter confirmed his darkest fears. He said he had suspected a leak, but he had never imagined the depth of the rot. He turned back to Elias. He asked if anyone else knew of this. Elias said only Isaac and Knox. Washington looked at Knox. He ordered him to double the guard on the river. He ordered him to prepare the boats. He said the timeline had changed. They could not wait. If the British knew of the plan for the 26th, then they had to strike before then, or they had to change the plan entirely. He looked at Elias again. He asked if he knew who the snake was. Elias shook his head. He said the code didn't give a name, only the symbol. Washington walked back to the desk and picked up a quill. He wrote a name on a scrap of paper and handed it to Elias. He asked if he had ever seen this man. Elias looked at the name. General Charles Lee, the second in command, the man who was currently a prisoner of the British, having been captured days ago in a tavern. Elias looked up confused. He said Lee was a prisoner. Washington nodded. He said Lee was a prisoner, yes, but his letters still found their way out. He said Lee had always coveted the command. He said the snake was not in the tent, it was in the cage, but its venom still reached the camp. Washington took the scrap of paper back and burned it in the candle flame. He told Elias that he had done a great service to his country. He said that because of this warning they would not be caught sleeping. He said they would cross the river not on the 26th but on the 25th, Christmas night. They would strike Trenton while the Hessians were drunk and celebrating. They would turn the trap around. But then Washington's expression darkened. He said that for this to work, the British must still believe their plan was secret. They must believe the spy was successful. He looked at Elias with a grim intensity. He said he needed Elias to do one more thing, a thing that was harder than crossing the wilderness. He needed Elias to go back across the river, to plant a false signal, to make the British believe that the army was mutinying, that there would be no attack. He wanted Elias to be the decoy. Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Go back to the freezing river, back to the Hessians, back to the land of ashes. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to say he had done enough. He looked at Knox, who looked away, unable to meet his eyes. He looked at Washington. He saw the pain in the general's eyes, the terrible burden of command that required him to ask men to die for a cause. Elias thought of his village. He thought of the toy horse in his pocket. He thought of the word liberty. He realized that there was no going back to the forge, not really. The iron was in the fire and it had to be hammered until it was done. He straightened his shoulders. He nodded. He said he would do it. Washington stepped forward and placed a hand on Elias' shoulder. He said that history would not know his name perhaps, but it would know his deed. He gave Elias a new packet sealed with his own ring. He said this contained false information, plans for a retreat. Elias was to let himself be seen and let the packet be found. It was a suicide mission, or close to it. Elias took the packet. He turned to leave. Knox stopped him at the door, handing him a flask of rum and a fresh pistol. He said, "Godspeed, Elias." Elias walked out of the farmhouse and back into the cold. The snow was falling harder, now a white curtain that obscured the world. The gathering storm had arrived. He walked back towards the river, his heart heavy but his spirit clear. He was the gathering storm. He was the wind that would fan the flames of the revolution. He looked at the river one last time. It was waiting for him. The black water, the white ice, the silence. He stepped into the boat that was waiting to take him back. He was going home, not to the village but to the war. The chapter was closing, but the battle was just beginning. And Elias Vance was ready to play his part in the silent war that would ring through the ages.